In the shadow of World War II, one soldier's act of kindness toward enemy refugees would spark a battle fiercer than any fought on the front lines. Private Ace Dalton never imagined that offering soup to a sick Japanese woman would put his military career, and possibly his life, on the line. As Emi Takahara's fever rises and military police close in, Ace faces an impossible choice: follow orders and send her to certain death, or risk everything for someone he's supposed to hate. When a hidden letter reveals the shocking true motives behind their transfer orders, the small coastal depot becomes ground zero for a different kind of war. One fought not with bullets, but with the courage to stand for humanity when the world has gone mad. Subscribe now and drop a comment telling me if you would have had the courage to defy orders like Ace. Because sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on bloody beaches, but in the quiet corners of our own conscience. A cold November dawn broke over the California coast. The rising sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, but Private Ace Dalton barely noticed the beauty. The wind whipped his face as he hurried across the muddy yard of the Army depot. Waves crashed against the wooden pilings below, sending spray high into the air. The depot had once been a sardine-packing warehouse. Now it served the war effort, storing supplies and sometimes housing prisoners. The smell of fish still lingered in the corners, mixing with the scents of coffee, wet wool, and salt air. Ace stamped his boots on the wooden steps before entering the kitchen. Inside, the warmth hit him like a blessing. He unwrapped his scarf and nodded to the cook. "Mornin', Mac. Some weather we're having." "Been worse," Mac grunted, stirring a pot of oatmeal. "Gonna get worse before it gets better, they say." Ace washed his hands in a basin of warm water. "Need help with those potatoes?" "Much obliged," Mac said, pointing to a sack in the corner. "Colonel wants a special Thanksgiving meal tomorrow. Don't know where he thinks we're going to find a turkey, though." Ace grabbed a knife and started peeling. His hands were rough from farm work before the army, and he made quick work of the potatoes. Through the small window, he could see soldiers unloading crates from wagons. The mud made the work twice as hard. "Look at that," Mac said, coming to stand beside him. "What's Harding got now?" A military truck had pulled up. The back flap opened, and 7 women climbed out. They wore thin coats that flapped in the wind. Their dark hair blew around their faces as they huddled together, looking lost and frightened. "Japanese," Mac whispered. "Must be from that ship that got torpedoed. Heard some civilians survived." Ace watched as the women were led toward the barracks building. They walked with their heads down, shoulders hunched against the cold. One woman stumbled, and a soldier caught her arm. She flinched away from his touch. "They look half-starved," Ace said quietly. "Ain't our problem," Mac replied, turning back to his cooking. But Ace couldn't stop watching. One of the women glanced toward the kitchen window. Their eyes met briefly. Hers were dark with fear and exhaustion. Ace felt something twist in his chest. Later that morning, Ace carried a tray of coffee to the officers' meeting room. Colonel Harding sat at the head of the table, his silver hair neatly combed, his uniform perfectly pressed despite the damp weather. "We have 7 Japanese civilian women," Harding was saying as Ace entered. "They were aboard a merchant vessel that was sunk by one of our submarines 3 days ago. They were floating in a lifeboat until a patrol picked them up." "Are they spies?" Lieutenant Porter asked. Harding shook his head. "They're civilians, mostly merchants' wives returning to Japan. They've been questioned already. They're not a security threat, but they are our responsibility until transport can be arranged." Ace set the coffee tray on the table and began pouring cups. He tried to look invisible, the way servants were supposed to. "Where are we putting them?" asked Captain Morris. "East Barracks for now. It's separated from the main compound, and we can secure it easily." "What about food?" This from Nurse Helen Price, who sat at the far end of the table. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face was kind but serious. "That's why I called this meeting," Harding said. He looked at Ace, who froze with the coffee pot in mid-air. "Private Dalton." "Yes, sir?" "You're helping Mac with the Thanksgiving preparations?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I want those women to have a proper meal tomorrow, at the same table as our nurses." A murmur went around the table. Lieutenant Porter's face darkened. "Sir, with all due respect," he began. "This isn't up for debate, Lieutenant," Harding cut him off. "They're civilians, women, and they're half-starved. We will treat them with dignity." Ace finished pouring the coffee and slipped out. His mind was already racing, counting supplies, wondering how to stretch what they had to feed everyone properly. In the kitchen, he found Mac arguing with the supply sergeant. "You're telling me all we get is this scrawny bird and these dried-up vegetables?" Mac waved a hand at the meager supplies on the counter. "Be thankful we got that," the sergeant replied. "There's a war on, in case you forgot." Ace stepped forward. "Sergeant Williams, Colonel Harding wants the Japanese women to join the Thanksgiving meal." Williams raised his eyebrows. "Those prisoners? Eating our food?" "Those guests," Ace corrected gently. "And yes, sir, that's the order." Williams shook his head, but didn't argue further. When he left, Mac turned to Ace with a worried expression. "How are we supposed to feed everyone with this?" he asked. Ace looked at the small turkey, the sack of potatoes, the dried cranberries, and the few cans of vegetables. It wasn't much, but it was more than many people had these days. "We'll make it work," he said. "My ma could feed 12 people with less than this. It's all about how you prepare it." By afternoon, Ace had everything organized. The turkey was stuffed with a mixture of bread, herbs, and the last of the onions. Potatoes were peeled and ready for boiling. He'd even managed to find flour and shortening for biscuits. Through the window, he could see the Japanese women in their barracks. They sat close together on 2 bunks, still wearing their coats. A soldier stood guard outside their door. Ace wiped his hands on his apron and went to find Nurse Price. Helen was in the infirmary, counting medicine bottles. Her white uniform was spotless despite the mud and rain outside. "Miss Price," Ace said, removing his cap. "Could I have a word?" She looked up and smiled. "Of course, Private Dalton. And I've told you before, call me Helen." "Helen, then. I was wondering about those women. Do you think they need medical attention?" Helen's smile faded. "Probably. They've been through a terrible ordeal, but I haven't been given permission to examine them yet." "Could you maybe check on them anyway? Bring them some hot tea? I noticed they're still wearing their coats inside." Helen looked at him thoughtfully. "You're worried about them." Ace nodded. "My ma always said, treat others how you'd want to be treated if you were in their shoes." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." Helen put the medicine bottles away. "I'll see what I can do." Later, Ace watched from the kitchen window as Helen approached the barracks with a tray of steaming cups. The guard let her pass after checking the contents of the tray. Through the open door, Ace could see the women's surprised faces as Helen offered them the tea. The rain continued all night, drumming on the roof of the barracks where Ace slept. He dreamed of his mother's kitchen back home in Nebraska, warm and full of good smells. In the dream, the Japanese women sat at the table, smiling and well-fed. Thanksgiving morning dawned gray but dry. Ace was up before sunrise, lighting the stoves and starting the cooking. Mac joined him an hour later, grumbling about the early hour but soon caught up in the rhythm of the work. By noon, the mess hall was transformed. Long wooden tables were set with mismatched tin plates and cups. Someone had found a few paper decorations from last Christmas, and these were hung from the ceiling. It wasn't fancy, but it was festive. Not bad, Colonel Harding said, inspecting their work. Not bad at all, Private. Thank you, sir. Ace straightened his uniform. He'd changed out of his cooking clothes for the meal. I want you to sit with our guests, Harding said. Make them feel welcome. Me, sir? You're good with people, Dalton. And this was partly your idea, wasn't it? Nurse Price told me you were concerned about them. Ace felt his face grow warm. I just thought they deserved kindness, sir. Harding nodded. That they do, son? That they do. At 1 o'clock, the mess hall began to fill. Soldiers came in, stamping mud from their boots, talking and laughing. They fell silent when Helen led the 7 Japanese women into the room. The women had washed and combed their hair. Their clothes were still the same, simple dresses under their coats, but they looked more composed than yesterday. They followed Helen to the table where Ace stood waiting. Ladies, this is Private Dalton, Helen said. He helped prepare our meal today. Ace bowed slightly, the way he'd seen in pictures. Welcome, he said. Please sit down. The women bowed in return, deeper than he had. They sat close together on one side of the table. Helen sat beside them, and Ace took a seat across from them. The oldest woman spoke softly in Japanese. The others nodded. Then she looked at Ace and said in careful English, Thank you for kindness. You're welcome, ma'am, Ace replied. I hope you enjoy the meal. Colonel Harding stood at the head of the room and raised his hands for silence. Before we begin, he said, I want to remind everyone that Thanksgiving is about gratitude. We give thanks for what we have, even in difficult times. Today, we also give thanks that these women survived their ordeal at sea, and that we have the opportunity to offer them safety and comfort. He nodded to the chaplain, who said a brief prayer. Then servers began bringing out the food, plates of sliced turkey, bowls of mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, green beans, and biscuits. It wasn't as plentiful as a peacetime Thanksgiving, but it was a feast compared to regular army rations. Ace watched as the Japanese women were served. Their eyes widened at the portions. We have to make this last all week? One whispered in accented English. Ace felt that twist in his chest again. No, ma'am, he said gently. This is just for today, but we'll make sure you have enough food every day you're here. The women looked at each other, then back at their plates. Slowly, they began to eat. At first, they took tiny bites, as if afraid the food might disappear. But as the meal progressed, they relaxed a little. One woman, younger than the others, caught Ace's eye. She had a gentle face and a quiet dignity about her. When he smiled at her, she smiled back, just a small curve of her lips, but it transformed her face. What's your name? Ace asked. Emmy, she replied softly. Emmy Takahara. Pleased to meet you, Miss Takahara. I'm Asa Dalton, but most folks call me Ace. Ace, she repeated. Like card game? He chuckled. That's right. My brothers gave me that nickname when I was little. Said I was always trying to be the best at everything. She nodded, as if she understood completely. As they ate, the chaplain began to hum a hymn. Others joined in, and soon the room filled with the familiar melody of For the Beauty of the Earth. To everyone's surprise, Emmy began to hum along, then softly sing words in Japanese. The room fell silent as her clear voice rose and fell with the tune. When she finished, there was a moment of perfect stillness. Then the chaplain smiled broadly. The Lord's music crosses all boundaries, he said. Thank you, my dear. Emmy ducked her head, embarrassed by the attention. But Ace noticed that some of the soldiers who had looked suspicious earlier now wore thoughtful expressions. After the meal, the women helped clear the tables, insisting, despite Helen's protests, that they wanted to be useful. In the kitchen, they washed dishes alongside the soldiers, working in companionable silence. By evening, the storm had returned. Rain pounded the depot, and wind howled around the buildings. Ace finished cleaning the galley while Helen checked on the women in their quarters. When she returned, her face was worried. "What's wrong?" Ace asked. "It's Emmy," Helen said quietly. "She's coughing badly, and I think she has a fever. I'm concerned it might be pneumonia." "Can't you take her to the infirmary?" Helen shook her head. "Not without paperwork. They're still classified as POW civilians, even if Colonel Harding is treating them better than regulations require." Ace frowned. "That's not right. She needs medicine, warm blankets." "I know. I've given her what I could. Aspirin, an extra blanket. But if it is pneumonia..." Helen didn't finish the sentence. They both knew how dangerous that could be. "I'll bring her some hot broth," Ace decided. "That might help." "Be careful," Helen warned. "If you're caught giving extra food to prisoners..." "They're not prisoners," Ace said firmly. "They're people who need help. My ma always said, 'Do what's right even when it's hard.'" Helen smiled sadly. "Your mother and mine would have gotten along well." Later that night, Ace heated a pot of chicken broth. The kitchen was dark, except for a small lantern he'd lit. Outside, the storm raged on, covering any sounds he might make. He filled a thermos with the steaming broth and slipped out the back door. The rain soaked him immediately, but he hurried across the yard to the East Barracks. The guard was huddled in the doorway, trying to stay dry. He straightened when he saw Ace. "What's your business, Private?" he asked. "Just bringing some medicine from Nurse Price," Ace said, showing the thermos. It wasn't exactly a lie. The broth was a kind of medicine. The guard nodded and let him pass. Inside, the barracks was dimly lit by a single bulb. The women sat or lay on their bunks, some already asleep. Emmy was awake, wrapped in blankets, her face flushed with fever. "Miss Takahara," Ace said softly, "I brought you something to help with your cough." She looked up, recognition dawning slowly in her feverish eyes. "Asa-san?" He knelt beside her bunk and opened the thermos. The smell of chicken and herbs filled the air. "Can you drink some of this?" She nodded weakly. Ace helped her sit up and held the cup to her lips. She sipped slowly, closing her eyes as the warm liquid soothed her throat. "Thank you," she whispered between sips. "So kind." "Just doing what anyone would do," Ace replied, though he knew that wasn't true. Plenty of people wouldn't bother to help an enemy alien, no matter how sick or helpless. When she finished the broth, Ace helped her lie back down. Her breathing seemed a little easier, but her forehead was still hot to the touch. "Try to rest," he said. "I'll come back tomorrow." She caught his hand as he stood to leave. Her fingers were small but surprisingly strong. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me?" Ace thought for a moment. "Because it's right," he said simply. "And because war's taken enough from all of us. It doesn't need to take our humanity, too." Emmy's eyes filled with tears. She said something in Japanese that Ace couldn't understand, but her meaning was clear in the way she squeezed his hand. Early the next morning, Ace checked the bulletin board, as he did every day. A new notice caught his eye. Transfer orders for the Japanese women. They were to be moved inland in 72 hours. Beside him, a corporal was reading the same notice. "About time," the man said. "Moving them to that new camp in the mountains." "The mountains?" Ace asked. "But it's winter. It'll be freezing up there." The corporal shrugged. "Not our problem. Heard that camp's not even finished yet. Barely got roofs on the buildings, let alone heating." Ace felt cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. Emmy was already sick. A journey in winter weather, followed by time in an unheated camp, could kill her. He had to do something. But what could one private do against army orders? As he pondered this, the door opened, and a local fisherman came in carrying a crate of fresh fish. "Morning," the man said cheerfully. "Brought you fellas something special. Ocean gave us a good catch despite the weather." "Much obliged," Ace said, inspecting the silvery fish. "These will make a fine supper." "Used to trade with Japanese fishermen before the war," the man said conversationally. "Good folks, most of them. Had a neighbor, Tanaka, best boat builder on the coast. Wonder what happened to him after they took them all away." Ace nodded, listening to the fisherman's reminiscences. It reminded him that before Pearl Harbor, Japanese and Americans had lived and worked side by side. They weren't natural enemies. War had made them so. By mid-morning, the rain had turned to hail. Ace helped distribute fresh blankets to the women, donated by local townsfolk who had heard about the refugees. Emmy was still feverish, her cough worse than before. While the others were distracted with the blankets, Ace helped her to a chair near the small stove. It wasn't much warmer there, but every bit helped. "Hang on," he whispered to her. "Just hang on. We'll keep you safe till this storm lets up." She managed a small smile, through her discomfort. "I trust you," she said softly. "Good man. Kind heart." Ace returned to his duties with her words echoing in his mind. He had to find a way to help her, to help all the women. But with the transfer orders already posted, time was running out. That afternoon, the storm intensified. Ace was assigned to inventory duty in the supply shed. He worked methodically, counting crates and checking them against the manifest. As he sorted through a stack of paperwork, a misplaced document caught his eye. It was a letter from a railroad executive to the Army commander of the region. In it, the executive pressed for the coastal depot to be cleared for freight staging, war materials being sent to the Pacific. Ace read the letter twice to be sure he understood. This was the reason for the hurried transfer order, not military necessity, but commercial pressure. The railroad wanted the depot, and the Japanese women were in the way. The letter contradicted humanitarian regulations for non-combatant detainees. They were supposed to be housed in suitable conditions, not rushed to an unfinished camp in winter. Ace folded the letter and tucked it inside his coat. It might be nothing, or it might be the key to saving Emmy's life. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal. The lantern flickered, casting jumping shadows on the walls of the shed. Ace felt the weight of the letter against his chest, along with the weight of the decision he needed to make. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. His mother had taught him that too, though she probably never imagined he'd apply the lesson quite like this. With a deep breath, Ace turned out the lantern and stepped into the storm, his mind made up. Whatever came next, he wouldn't stand by and watch Emmy, or any of the women, suffer if he could prevent it. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet as he made his way back to the main building. Rain soaked through his coat in seconds, but his steps were steady, and his heart was sure. Sometimes the hardest storms weren't the ones that came from the sky, but the ones that raged inside a person when they faced a choice between what was easy and what was right. For Ace Dalton, the choice was clear. Now he just had to find the courage to see it through. A cold November dawn broke over the California coast. Gray clouds hung low in the sky as heavy waves crashed against the wooden pilings of the Army depot. The building had once been a sardine packing warehouse before the war changed everything. Now it served as a storage place for military supplies, with the smell of fish still lingering in the corners. Private Asa Ace Dalton pulled his coat tighter as he crossed the muddy yard. Rain soaked his hat and dripped down his neck. The early morning watch soldiers huddled under an overhang, sipping cups of weak coffee that did little to warm them. "Morning, fellas," Ace called, stomping mud from his boots before entering the kitchen. "Ace, just the man I need," said Cook McIntosh, better known as Mac. "Colonel wants a special Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow. Got potatoes need peeling?" "Happy to help," Ace said, hanging his wet coat on a peg. He rolled up his sleeves and washed his hands in a basin of warm water. Through the kitchen window, Ace watched soldiers unloading supply wagons. The mud made their work twice as hard. Then a military truck pulled up, different from the usual supply vehicles. "What's happening out there?" Mac asked, coming to stand beside him. The back flap of the truck opened, and 7 women climbed out. They wore thin coats that flapped in the wind, and their dark hair whipped around their faces. Even from a distance, Ace could see they were Japanese. "Must be from that ship that got torpedoed," Mac said quietly. "Heard some civilians survived." The women huddled together, trembling from both cold and fear. A sergeant led them toward the East Barracks, separate from the main buildings. One woman stumbled, and though a soldier caught her arm to steady her, she flinched away from his touch. "They look half-starved," Ace said, feeling a twinge in his chest. "Ain't our concern," Mac replied, turning back to his cooking. But as Ace began peeling potatoes, he couldn't forget the fear in their eyes. His mother had raised him to care about all people, no matter where they came from. And these women looked like they hadn't had a decent meal in weeks. Later, Ace was asked to bring coffee to the officers' meeting. He entered quietly, trying to be invisible as he set down the tray and began pouring. "We have 7 Japanese civilian women," Colonel Harding was saying. His silver hair was neatly combed, his uniform perfectly pressed despite the damp weather. "They were aboard a merchant vessel that was sunk 3 days ago. They're not a threat, but they are our responsibility until transport can be arranged." "Where are we putting them?" asked Captain Morris. "East Barracks for now," Harding replied. "It's separated from the main compound." "What about food?" This came from Nurse Helen Price, who sat at the far end of the table. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face was kind but serious. "That's why I called this meeting," Harding said. He looked directly at Ace, who froze with the coffee pot in mid-air. "Private Dalton." "Yes, sir." "You're helping with the Thanksgiving preparations?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I want those women to have a proper meal tomorrow, at the same table as our nurses." A murmur went around the table. Lieutenant Porter's face darkened. "Sir, with all due respect," he began. "This isn't up for debate, Lieutenant," Harding cut him off. "They're civilians, women, and they're half-starved. We will treat them with dignity." Ace finished pouring the coffee and slipped out. In the kitchen, he found Mac arguing with the supply sergeant about their meager Thanksgiving provisions. "Colonel Harding wants the Japanese women to join the meal," Ace told them. The sergeant raised his eyebrows. "Those prisoners eating our food?" "Those guests," Ace corrected gently. "That's the order." As evening fell, Ace finished his kitchen duties and stepped outside. The rain had stopped, but the wind still blew cold off the ocean. Through the window of the East Barracks, he could see the women sitting close together, still wearing their coats. They looked lost and afraid. Ace stirred a pot of thin gravy, glancing toward the barracks. Something needed to be done, and soon. The next morning, soldiers queued for breakfast, their boots tracking mud across the floor. Ace worked quickly, helping serve the hot oatmeal and coffee. Through the open doorway, he could see the Japanese women still confined to their section, a rope barrier keeping them separate from the rest of the depot. "They look terrible," Nurse Helen Price said, appearing beside him with an empty tray. "I'm worried about their health." Ace nodded. "Have you been allowed to check on them?" Not yet. Still waiting for permission. Helen's face showed her frustration. But I'm going to bring them some tea, at least. It's not much, but it's something. I'll help, Ace offered. He filled 7 cups with hot water and added the last of the barley tea they had in the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. At mid-morning, Colonel Harding called another staff meeting. Ace stood at attention along with the other kitchen workers. These women will be with us through Thanksgiving, Harding announced. I want them treated with respect. They're not prisoners of war. They're civilian refugees. Lieutenant Porter frowned. Sir, regulations clearly state— I'm familiar with the regulations, Lieutenant, Harding said sharply. And I'm also familiar with basic human decency. These women have lost everything. The least we can do is offer them kindness while they're in our care. After the meeting, Ace watched as Helen approached the barracks with the tray of tea. The guard checked the contents before letting her pass. Through the open door, Ace could see the women's surprised faces as Helen offered them the steaming cups. One woman, younger than the others with a gentle face, bowed deeply to Helen before accepting a cup. She warmed her hands over the steam, closing her eyes briefly in appreciation. Something about her struck Ace, a quiet dignity despite her circumstances. Later, Ace approached Helen as she returned from the infirmary. How are they? He asked. Tired? Frightened? Helen sighed. But the tea helped. The young one, her name is Emi Takahara, she speaks a little English. She thanked me for the unexpected kindness. Unexpected kindness, Ace repeated, like they didn't think they deserved it. Helen nodded sadly. War does terrible things to people's minds, makes us see enemies where there are just other humans. The women watched the bustling kitchen from behind the rope barrier, their eyes following the movements of Ace and the other cooks. They seemed unsure whether to trust the unexpected kindness, but the warm cups of barley tea had softened their guarded expressions slightly. Thanksgiving afternoon arrived with a brief break in the rain. Ace and several other soldiers set up long wooden tables in the mess hall, covering them with paper tablecloths, a luxury saved for special occasions. They placed mismatched tin plates and cups at each setting. Seems wrong, muttered Corporal Jenkins as they worked. Feeding the enemy at our table. They ain't enemies, Ace said quietly. They're just women caught in a bad spot, same as any of us might be. Jenkins didn't look convinced, but he stopped complaining. At 1 o'clock, a bell rang for dinner. Soldiers filed in, taking their places at the tables. Then Colonel Harding himself escorted the 7 Japanese women into the room. They had washed their faces and combed their hair, though their clothes were still the same worn dresses. They followed Harding to a table where Helen and several other nurses already sat. Some soldiers whispered among themselves. A few made no effort to hide their scowls. But Harding's stern presence kept anyone from speaking out loud against the arrangements. Ace helped serve the meal, turkey sliced thin to make it go further, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, and fresh rolls. It wasn't as grand as peacetime Thanksgivings, but considering the rationing, it was a feast. The Japanese women accepted their plates with deep bows. Emi Takahara, the young woman Ace had noticed before, looked at her plate with wide eyes. We have to make this last all week? She whispered to the older woman beside her. The question, spoken in halting English, carried in the sudden quiet of the room. Ace felt a twist in his chest as he realized what she meant. They thought this food was their ration for an entire week, not just one meal. No, Miss Takahara, he said gently, stepping forward. This is just for today's dinner. You'll have fresh food tomorrow, too. Her eyes widened even more as she understood. She bowed her head, clearly embarrassed at having spoken aloud. But the other women looked equally surprised and relieved. The chaplain said a blessing over the food, and everyone began to eat. At first, the Japanese women took tiny bites, savoring each morsel as if afraid it might be taken away. Gradually, they relaxed a little, though they still ate far less than anyone else at the table. Halfway through the meal, the chaplain began to hum a hymn. Others joined in, and soon the mess hall filled with the melody of "For the Beauty of the Earth." To everyone's surprise, Emmy began to hum along, then softly sing words in Japanese. The room fell silent as her clear voice rose and fell with the familiar tune. When she finished, there was a moment of perfect stillness. The chaplain smiled warmly. "Music truly is the universal language," he said. "Thank you, my dear." Emmy ducked her head shyly, but Ace noticed that some of the soldiers who had looked suspicious earlier now wore thoughtful expressions. A brief cultural bridge had formed through the simple act of sharing a song. After the meal, the women insisted on helping clear the tables despite Helen's protests. In the kitchen, they washed dishes alongside the soldiers, working in companionable silence. The lanterns flickered as the meal ended, and Ace watched the women walk back to their quarters, their steps slightly steadier than before. An hour later, darkness fell over the depot. Blackout curtains were drawn tight across all windows to prevent light from being visible to enemy submarines offshore. Ace finished cleaning the galley while Helen inventoried medical supplies in a corner of the kitchen. "Need any help?" he asked, drying his hands on a towel. "Just about done," Helen replied. She closed her ledger with a sigh. "We're running low on antibiotics. The supply ship is late again." "Bad weather up north, I heard." Ace glanced out the window toward the east barracks. A light still burned inside, and he could see shadows moving. "I'm worried about those women. That barracks isn't well heated." "I know." Helen followed his gaze. "I managed to check on them briefly. The young one, Emmy, she's coughing badly. I think she might be getting sick." "Can't you move her to the infirmary?" Helen shook her head. "Regulations forbid moving POW civilians without proper paperwork. Even though Colonel Harding is being kind, they're still technically detainees." Ace frowned. "That ain't right. She needs proper care." "I slipped her some aspirin," Helen said. "It's all I could do for now." Through the window, Ace spotted Emmy struggling with a coughing fit. Even from a distance, he could see she was unsteady on her feet, supporting herself against a wall. "Let me take them some broth, at least," he suggested. "Mac made plenty for tomorrow." Helen hesitated. "You could get in trouble." "Some things are worth the risk." Ace was already filling a thermos. "My ma always said, 'Do what's right, even when it's hard.'" Helen smiled slightly. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small paper packet. "Give her these too. It's more aspirin. Take her temperature if you can." Ace slipped out the back door with the thermos of hot broth. The guard at the East Barracks recognized him from the kitchen and let him pass after a brief explanation. Inside, the 7 women sat or lay on their narrow bunks. The room was cold, despite the small stove in the corner. Emmy sat wrapped in a blanket, shivering despite the covering. Her face was flushed and her eyes too bright. When Ace approached, she looked up in surprise. "Brought you some broth," he said, holding out the thermos. "It'll help warm you up." "Thank you," Emmy whispered between coughs. Her English was better than he'd expected. Ace helped her hold the cup as she sipped the hot liquid. The other women watched warily at first, then with growing trust as they saw his gentle manner. He offered them broth, too, which they accepted with deep bows. As Emmy drank, Ace placed the back of his hand against her forehead, the way his mother used to check for fever. Her skin burned against his. "You're sick," he said quietly. "You need medicine. A real doctor." "I will be well," she insisted. though another coughing fit contradicted her words. "Please, do not trouble yourself." "It's no trouble." Ace gave her the aspirin Helen had sent. "Take these. They'll help with the fever." When he left the barracks, the coastal wind had picked up again. A gust rattled the window panes as Ace made his way back to the main building. He found Helen waiting for him in the kitchen. "How is she?" Helen asked. "Burning up with fever," Ace replied grimly. "She needs real care, not just aspirin and broth." "I'll try talking to Colonel Harding in the morning," Helen promised. "Maybe he can override the regulations." Ace nodded, though worry still gnawed at him. As he prepared to leave, he paused in the doorway. "What happens to them after they leave here?" he asked. Helen's expression grew troubled. "They'll be sent to an internment camp inland. Some are better than others. I hope they get a decent one." A coastal gust rattled the window panes again as Ace made his way to his own quarters. He lay awake long into the night, listening to the storm and thinking of Emmy's fever-bright eyes. Something had to be done, and soon. He fell asleep resolving privately to help her, even if it meant risking punishment. Early the next morning, long before réveillé, Ace slipped into the dark kitchen. The depot was silent except for the distant crash of waves and the occasional creak of the old building settling. He lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low to avoid attracting attention. Working quickly, he heated more broth and added herbs from his mother's recipe, thyme and sage that he'd been saving for special cooking. The fragrant steam rose from the pot, reminding him of home in Nebraska, where his mother had nursed 7 children through winter sicknesses. He filled a thermos and wrapped several biscuits in a clean cloth. Then he extinguished the lantern and made his way through the pre-dawn darkness to the East Barracks. The same guard stood at the door, looking tired after his long night watch. "Early for kitchen duty, isn't it, Dalton?" he asked, eyeing the thermos. "Special request from Nurse Price," Ace lied smoothly, "for the sick woman." The guard hesitated, then nodded. "Make it quick." Inside, most of the women were still asleep. Emmy sat awake on her bunk, a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. Her cough had worsened, and her breathing came in short, labored gasps. "You came back," she whispered when she saw him. "Course I did." Ace knelt beside her. "Bunk." "Brought you something to help with that cough." As Emmy sipped the broth, Ace noticed how her hands trembled. Her fever seemed even higher than before. She needed real medical care, not just broth and aspirin. When he left the barracks, he found Helen waiting for him near the kitchen. "I was hoping to catch you," she said, pulling him aside where they wouldn't be overheard. "Emmy's condition is deteriorating. I checked on her an hour ago. Her lungs are filling with fluid. It's definitely pneumonia." Ace's heart sank. "What can we do?" "She needs antibiotics, proper bed rest in a warm room." Helen looked around nervously before continuing. "There's something else. Colonel Harding received orders this morning. The women are being transferred inland in 72 hours. "Transferred? Where to?" "A new camp in the mountains. It's not even finished yet, according to the paperwork I saw. And with winter coming on..." She didn't need to finish the thought. Ace felt cold, despite the morning sun breaking through the clouds. "Emmy won't survive that trip, not in her condition." "I know." Helen's face showed her distress. "I've requested permission to treat her in the infirmary, but I don't know if it will be granted in time." As they talked, a corporal passed by, talking loudly with another soldier. "Heard they're rushing to clear this place for railroad use. Big executive's been pushing for it. Wants the depot for freight staging. That's why they're shipping those Jap women out so fast, ready or not." Ace and Helen exchanged troubled looks. This wasn't about military necessity. It was about commercial pressure. I need to check the bulletin board, Ace said. Sure enough, the transfer notice was pinned prominently, ordering the women to be ready for transport in 3 days. Beside it was a memo about preparing the depot for essential transportation operations. Ace stared at the notice, his jaw tightening with resolve. The right thing to do was rarely the easy thing, his mother always said, and right now the right thing was clear, even if the path to doing it wasn't. By late morning, the rain had shifted to hail, pelting the buildings with tiny ice pellets. Waves crashed higher against the shore, and the wind howled around the corners of the buildings. Ace helped distribute fresh blankets to the women, donated by local townsfolk who had heard about the refugees. The women accepted them with deep bows and grateful smiles, wrapping themselves in the additional warmth. Emmy sat huddled on her bunk, her face pale except for 2 bright spots of fever on her cheeks. When a particularly bad coughing fit doubled her over, Ace made a quick decision. Though it meant breaching protocol, he gently lifted her and carried her to a chair near the small stove, where it was slightly warmer. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You are very kind." "Just trying to help," Ace replied, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. Before, he could say more. The barracks door opened, and a civilian entered, stomping snow from his boots. It was Tom Fisher, a local fisherman who sometimes supplied the depot with fresh catch. "Morning, folks," he called cheerfully. "Brought you some rockfish. Ocean's angry today, but she still gave us a good haul." Ace thanked him for the delivery. As Fisher handed over the crate of fish, he glanced at the Japanese women. "Reminds me of before the war," he said quietly. "Had good Japanese neighbors back then. Tanaka family. Finest boat builders on the coast. Wonder what happened to them after the evacuation." "You knew Japanese people?" Emmy asked hesitantly from her chair. Fisher turned to her with a kind smile. "Sure did, miss. Half the fishing fleet was Japanese before the war. Good people, hard workers. This war's a terrible thing, turning neighbors against each other." After Fisher left, Ace noticed how the women talked quietly among themselves, seeming heartened by the fisherman's words. Even some of the soldiers on duty seemed thoughtful, their suspicion softening slightly. By afternoon, the storm had intensified again. Ace helped the women move their bunks farther from the leaking spots in the roof. As he worked, he kept a worried eye on Emmy, whose breathing grew more labored by the hour. When it was time to return to the main building, he paused in the doorway. "We'll keep you safe till this storm lets up," he promised quietly. Thunder rolled in the distance as he walked back through the hail, his mind working on a plan. The women needed help, especially Emmy. And somehow, he was going to make sure they got it, no matter what the transfer orders said. Afternoon shadows stretched across the depot yard as Ace made his way to the supply shed. The storm continued to rage, wind whistling through the cracks in the wooden walls. His assignment was simple: check inventory and update the records. But his mind kept returning to Emmy's feverish face and labored breathing. The supply shed smelled of damp wood and canvas. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes of ammunition, canned food, medical supplies, and spare parts. Ace worked methodically, counting items and marking them on his clipboard. The monotonous task usually calmed him, but today his thoughts were too troubled. 3 boxes of bandages, 2 crates of ration tins, he muttered, trying to focus. In a corner he found a filing cabinet with paperwork that needed sorting. Most were standard requisition forms and transfer orders, the everyday paperwork of Army life. But as he flipped through one folder, a letter caught his eye. It was typed on expensive stationery with a railroad company letterhead. Ace pulled it out and began to read. The letter was from James Harrington, an executive with Western Pacific Railroad, to General Simmons, the regional Army commander. It described the urgent need to use the coastal depot as a freight staging area for war materials being shipped to the Pacific. The current occupants can be relocated with minimal disruption, the letter stated. The railroad's use of this facility is essential to the war effort and should take precedence over temporary housing of non-essential personnel. Ace read the letter twice, his hands growing cold despite the work gloves he wore. Non-essential personnel meant the Japanese women. The transfer order wasn't about proper housing or security. It was about clearing the depot for commercial use. He flipped to the next page and found a response from General Simmons, dated just 3 days ago. Arrangements made for transfer of detainees to Camp Briarwood. Facility will be available for railroad use by December 1st. Camp Briarwood. That had to be the mountain camp Helen had mentioned, the one that wasn't properly finished or heated. They were sending sick women to an unfinished camp in winter, all to make room for railroad freight. The discovery made Ace's stomach twist. It contradicted the humanitarian regulations for non-combatant detainees that he'd learned about in basic training. Those rules stated clearly that civilians should be housed in suitable conditions with proper heating and medical care. Carefully, Ace folded the letter and slipped it inside his jacket. He wasn't sure what he would do with this information, but he knew it might be important. Outside, the storm intensified, rain turning to sleet that rattled against the roof like tiny bullets. Ace finished his inventory work quickly, his mind racing with possibilities. The lantern guttered in a draft as he gathered his things, casting jumping shadows on the walls. He tucked the letter securely in his inner pocket and buttoned his jacket tight before stepping back into the storm. Evening fell early. Darkness deepened by the storm clouds. In the mess hall, soldiers finished their supper of fish stew and bread. The mood was subdued, everyone tired of the endless rain and wind. Ace had just finished cleaning up when Helen burst through the door, her nurse's cap askew and her face flushed with urgency. "Ace, I need you," she said in a low voice, pulling him into a quiet corner. "It's Emmy. She's much worse." "How bad?" Ace asked, already reaching for his coat. "Bad. Her fever's spiked and she's delirious. Her breathing—" Helen's professional composure slipped, revealing her fear. "I don't think she'll last the night without proper care." "What about your request to move her to the infirmary?" Helen shook her head. "Denied. Lieutenant Porter says they need to follow protocol. No special treatment for detainees." Ace's hand went to his pocket, feeling the letter hidden there. "This is wrong, Helen. They're pushing these women out to make room for railroad freight. I found proof." He quickly explained what he'd discovered in the supply shed. Helen's eyes widened. That's terrible. But what can we do? We're just a private and a nurse." Ace looked out the window towards the East Barracks, barely visible through the rain. Then he straightened his shoulders. Decision made. "We help her anyway, protocol or not." "Ace, that's serious. You could face court-martial." "Some things matter more than rules." His voice was quiet, but firm. "My ma always said, stand up for what's right, even when you stand alone." "I ain't planning to stand alone, though. Will you help me?" Helen hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Of course I will. But we need a plan." They worked quickly, gathering supplies. Helen filled her medical bag with antibiotics and other medicines from the infirmary. Ace found a stretcher in the storage closet and hid it behind the kitchen door. They would wait until the night watch changed at 10 p.m., when there would be a brief gap in surveillance. At 9:55, Ace slipped out the back door of the kitchen into the howling storm. Rain soaked him immediately, but he hardly noticed as he made his way to the East Barracks, stretcher tucked under his arm. The night guard was huddled in the doorway, collar turned up against the wind. When he saw Ace approach, he straightened. "What's your business, Private?" he asked, eyeing the stretcher. Medical emergency, Ace replied, trying to sound official. Nurse Price sent me. One of the women needs urgent care. The guard hesitated. I didn't get any orders about this. Came straight from Colonel Harding, Ace lied, praying the guard wouldn't verify. You want to be responsible if she dies on your watch? That did it. The guard stepped aside, though he still looked uncertain. Make it quick, Dalton. Inside, the other Japanese women were gathered around Emmy's bunk, their faces drawn with worry. They moved aside when Ace entered, recognizing him as a friend. Emmy lay still, her face flushed with fever. Her breathing came in short, painful gasps. When Ace touched her forehead, the heat radiating from her skin alarmed him. Miss Takahara, he said gently. Emmy, we're going to move you somewhere warmer, somewhere you can get better. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever. She murmured something in Japanese. She says thank you, one of the other women translated. She says you are kind like her brother. With gentle care, Ace lifted Emmy onto the stretcher. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, frail from weeks of poor nutrition. The other women helped tuck blankets around her. I'll take good care of her, Ace promised them. She'll be safe. The oldest woman bowed deeply. We trust you, she said in halting English. The guard raised his eyebrows when Ace emerged with Emmy on the stretcher, but didn't stop him. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and Ace hunched over the stretcher, trying to shield Emmy from the worst of it. Helen was waiting at the back door of the infirmary, anxiously scanning the darkness. Her face relaxed when she saw them. Quickly, she urged, holding the door open. They carried Emmy inside and settled her on a cot in a small room off the main ward. Helen immediately began checking her vital signs, while Ace built up the fire in the small stove. Her temperature's dangerously high, Helen reported, her voice tense, and her lungs are congested. I'm starting her on penicillin right away. Ace watched as Helen worked, her hands skilled and gentle. After she'd given Emmy an injection and set up an IV drip, she sat back with a sigh. Now we wait, and hope no one reports us before morning. Emmy seemed tiny in the white hospital bed, her black hair spread across the pillow like a dark halo. Her breathing was still labored, but the warm room already seemed to be helping. I'll stay with her, Ace said, pulling a chair beside the bed. You should go, Helen warned. If they find you here, I'll take my chances. He settled into the chair, his mind made up. Helen nodded, understanding. I'll check back in an hour. If anyone asks, I'll say I acted alone. After she left, Ace sat in the quiet room, listening to the rain on the roof and Emmy's ragged breathing. He thought about the letter in his pocket, and wondered what Colonel Harding would do if he knew the truth. Harding seemed like a fair man, but he was also a military officer bound by orders. Emmy stirred, murmuring in her sleep. Ace leaned forward and gently took her hand. You're going to be all right, he whispered, not sure if she could hear him. I promise. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small room, the lantern cast a warm glow on Emmy's face. Her breathing gradually steadied, and her hand relaxed in his. Ace sat beside her until her breathing steadied, carrying out his moral conviction despite the risk of punishment. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when the door to Emmy's room burst open. Dr. Morris, the army physician, stood there in his bathrobe, his face tight with anger. Behind him, Helen looked apologetic. What in blazes is going on here? Dr. Morris demanded, staring at Ace, who was still sitting beside Emmy's bed. Who authorized this transfer? Ace stood up, his back straight. No one, sir. It was my decision. Your decision? Dr. Morris's eyebrows shot up. Since when does a private make medical decisions in my infirmary? She was dying, sir, Ace said simply. She has pneumonia. The East Barracks is too cold and damp. Dr. Morris frowned and moved to Emmy's bedside. He checked her pulse, listened to her breathing, and felt her forehead. His expression softened slightly. You're right about the pneumonia, he admitted grudgingly. And yes, she would have gotten worse in those conditions. He turned to Helen. You administered penicillin? Yes, doctor. And an IV for hydration. Dr. Morris checked Emmy's chart. Well, you did everything correctly, Nurse Price, but this is still a serious breach of protocol. He glanced at Ace. For both of you. Before either could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway. Colonel Harding strode in, fully dressed despite the early hour. His face was like a thundercloud. Would someone care to explain why a detainee has been moved without authorization? He asked, his voice dangerously calm. Ace stepped forward. It was my doing, sir. Miss Takahara was critically ill. She needed immediate medical attention. And you didn't think to request permission first? There wasn't time, sir, and... Ace hesitated, then reached into his pocket for the railroad letter. I found this yesterday, sir. I believe it explains the rush to transfer the women, regardless of their welfare. Harding's eyes narrowed as he took the letter. He read it quickly, his expression darkening further. Where did you get this, Private? In the supply shed, sir. It was misfiled with the inventory reports. Harding folded the letter carefully and placed it in his own pocket. This doesn't excuse your actions, Dalton. You've violated direct orders and military protocol. Yes, sir. However, Harding continued, glancing at Emmy's sleeping form, I will take this new information into consideration. He turned to Dr. Morris. Doctor, your professional opinion? Dr. Morris sighed. She has bacterial pneumonia. Without treatment, she likely would have died within 48 hours, especially if transported in this weather. Harding nodded slowly. I see. He looked at Ace and Helen. You two remain here until I send for you. That's an order. Is that clear? Yes, sir, they replied in unison. After Harding and Dr. Morris left, Helen collapsed into a chair. We're in so much trouble? Maybe, Ace said. But look. He nodded toward Emmy, whose breathing was noticeably easier. She's already improving. That's something, at least. Helen managed a small smile. I don't regret it, you know, even if they court-martial us both. Me neither. They sat in companionable silence, watching the dawn break through the window. The storm had lessened somewhat, though rain still fell steadily. An hour later, they were summoned to Colonel Harding's office. Harding sat behind his desk, the railroad letter laid out in front of him. His face gave nothing away. Private Dalton, Nurse Price, he began formally, you have both violated military protocol and disobeyed standing orders regarding the handling of detainees. Ace stood at attention, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. Helen stood beside him, equally straight-backed. However, Harding continued, I have confirmed that the patient was indeed in critical condition. Dr. Morris informs me that your actions likely saved her life. He picked up the letter. As for this, I am concerned by its implications. The transfer order appears to prioritize commercial interests over humanitarian considerations. He looked directly at them. That said, I am still bound by orders from my superiors. We understand, sir, Ace said. Do you? Harding leaned forward. Do you understand what it means to be a soldier, Dalton? To follow orders even when they conflict with your personal feelings? I believe I do, sir. But I also believe in doing what's right. Harding studied him for a long moment. A soldier must sometimes make difficult choices. I will not punish you formally at this time, but this incident will be noted in your records, and the transfer order still stands for the remaining women. They will leave as scheduled." "But sir," Ace began. "Dismissed, Private," Harding cut him off. "You too, Nurse Price." Outside the office, Helen squeezed Ace's arm. "At least we're not being court-martialed, and Emmy can stay in the infirmary." "For now," Ace said grimly. "But what about the others? That camp isn't fit for human habitation." Helen had no answer for that. Later that morning, Ace watched from the kitchen window as Colonel Harding walked alone onto the wind-swept pier, the waves reflecting his growing unease over the transfer order. The man stood with his hands clasped behind his back, face turned toward the ocean, seemingly deep in thought. Ace wondered what battle was being fought inside him. Duty versus conscience, orders versus compassion. Late morning brought a break in the rain, and an unexpected visitor to the depot. Martha Whitfield, the town preacher's widow, arrived carrying a stack of quilts. Her gray hair was tucked neatly under a practical hat, and her kind face showed the wrinkles of someone who smiled often. "Good morning, Private," she called to Ace, who was chopping wood near the kitchen door. "I heard you have some ladies needing warm bedding." Ace leaned his axe against the chopping block. "Yes, ma'am. That's mighty kind of you to think of them." "Well, the Lord tells us to care for strangers in our land," Martha said matter-of-factly. "Where might I find them?" "East Barracks, ma'am. But I should warn you, they're Japanese." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly, but her smile didn't waver. "I figured as much from what I heard in town. Makes no difference to me. Cold is cold, no matter where you're from." Ace offered to carry the quilts for her, and together they walked to the East Barracks. The guard looked surprised to see Martha, but let them pass after checking the quilts for hidden items. Inside, the 6 remaining women were sitting on their bunks, mending clothes or talking quietly among themselves. They looked up in surprise when Martha entered. "Good morning, dears," she said warmly, as if she were greeting neighbors at a church social. "I've brought you some quilts to keep you warm. Made them myself." The women exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to respond to this unexpected kindness from a stranger. Then the oldest woman stood and bowed deeply. "Thank you," she said in careful English. "You are very kind." "Not at all," Martha replied, returning the bow somewhat awkwardly. "Just being neighborly." As Ace helped distribute the colorful quilts, Martha chatted with the women. Though they understood only some of her words, her friendly manner needed no translation. She admired their neat stitching on the mending they were doing, and showed them the patterns in her quilts. "Reminds me of the Tanaka family," she said to Ace. "Lovely people who used to live near us. Mrs. Tanaka made the most beautiful silk embroidery. Taught my daughter before they were taken away to those camps." She sighed. "Such a shame. What fear makes us do to each other?" After Martha left, Ace noticed a change in the women. They touched the quilts with gentle fingers, their faces softening. One began to hum softly as she folded her clothes, the same hymn Emmy had sung at Thanksgiving. Throughout the day, more townspeople arrived, bringing small gifts, jars of preserves, hand-knitted socks, a few books in English. Word had spread about the women, and many in the coastal town remembered their Japanese neighbors from before the war. "My kids went to school with the Yamamoto children," said Mr. Peterson, the hardware store owner, as he delivered a repaired heater for the barracks. "Good students, all of them, always willing to help others. Mitsuo Ikeda built half the boats in the harbor," added a weathered fisherman who brought fresh fish. "Finest craftsman I ever knew." Each visitor brought not just gifts, but also memories and stories, reminding everyone that before they were enemy aliens, the Japanese had been neighbors, friends, and valued members of the community. The soldiers watching this procession reacted with varying degrees of surprise and thoughtfulness. Some remained suspicious, but others began to question their assumptions. Ace overheard one young corporal ask another, "Makes you wonder, doesn't it? If these folks were so bad, why do so many people remember them fondly?" That afternoon, Ace visited Emmy in the infirmary. Her fever had broken, and though she was still weak, her eyes were clear and alert when he entered. "H-san," she said, her voice hoarse but stronger than before. "You saved my life." "Just got you where you needed to be," he replied, setting a small vase of wildflowers beside her bed. "Helen, Nurse Price, did the real saving." "Both of you," Emmy insisted. She reached for his hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong. "Thank you." "You're welcome." Ace felt suddenly shy. "How are you feeling?" "Better, still tired." She glanced towards the window. "The others? They are well?" "They're fine. Getting lots of visitors today, believe it or not. Seems the whole town's coming by with gifts." Emmy's eyes widened. "Visitors? For us?" "Yep. Turns out folks around here remember their Japanese neighbors pretty fondly." A tear slipped down Emmy's cheek. "We thought everyone hated us." "Not everyone," Ace said gently. "Not by a long shot." When he left the infirmary, Ace stepped outside and saw sunlight piercing the clouds. The first bright moment in days. It felt like a sign, a small hope breaking through the darkness. The kitchen bustled with rare optimism that afternoon. Ace moved between pots and pans, directing the cooking with an energy that made even grumpy Mac smile. "What's got into you, Dalton?" Mac asked, watching Ace knead bread dough with strong, practiced hands. "Just thinking we could all use something to lift our spirits," Ace replied. "With the Colonel's permission, I want to organize a special supper tonight. A gratitude supper, to thank the townspeople for their kindness." "And where do you propose we get extra food for this feast?" Mac raised an eyebrow. Ace grinned. "Already taken care of. The fishermen brought enough for everyone. The Peterson farm sent over vegetables, and Mrs. Whitfield promised 2 of her apple pies." Mac shook his head in amazement. "Well, I'll be—" Colonel Harding approved the plan with surprising enthusiasm. "A good idea, Private. Sometimes breaking bread together reminds us of our common humanity." With permission granted, Ace threw himself into the preparations. He asked supply for extra lanterns to make the mess hall more welcoming, and was surprised when they complied without complaint. Several soldiers volunteered to help set up tables and benches. The 6 Japanese women from the barracks were brought over to help, and they fell into the work with quiet determination. As they folded napkins and arranged tables, they began to share stories of home with the soldiers working alongside them. "In my village, we celebrate harvest with Lantern Festival," explained Suki, the youngest after Emmy. "Everyone makes paper lanterns, very beautiful. They float on river at night." "Sounds pretty," said Corporal Jenkins, the same man who had grumbled about the Thanksgiving arrangements. "Like our Christmas lights, maybe." Emmy was well enough to sit in a chair by the kitchen, wrapped in blankets. She showed Ace and Helen how to fold napkins into crane shapes, her nimble fingers creating delicate birds from the rough cloth. "Crane is symbol of long life," she explained. 1,000 cranes bring special wish." "What would you wish for?" Ace asked. Emmy looked thoughtful. "Peace," she said finally. "For everyone." As they worked, the barriers between them seemed to fade. They were no longer soldiers and detainees, Americans and Japanese, but simply people working together toward a common goal. Helen brought her small phonograph from the nurses' quarters and played soft music. To everyone's delight, one of the older Japanese women, Hana, recognized a melody and began to sing along in her language. "It's a folk song about cherry blossoms," she explained when the music ended. about how beautiful but brief life can be, like the blossoms that fall at the height of their beauty. Even Lieutenant Porter, who had been among the most skeptical, seemed moved by the song. Ace noticed him helping Hannah hang paper decorations she had made from old newspapers. His usual stern expression softened. As dusk fell, lanterns were hung along, the mess hall beams casting a warm amber light over the room. Tables were arranged in a square so everyone could see each other, and wildflowers from the hillside decorated the center. Ace stood in the doorway, surveying their work with satisfaction. For a few hours, at least, the war seemed very far away. The mess hall glowed with golden light as people began to gather for the gratitude supper. Lanterns hung from the ceiling beams, their gentle light reflecting off the polished tin plates and cups on the tables. The aroma of fresh bread, fish stew, and apple pie filled the air. Townspeople arrived in small groups, the fishermen and their wives, Mr. Peterson from the hardware store, Martha Whitfield with her grown daughter, and several others who had brought gifts earlier. They mingled with the soldiers, the nurses, and the Japanese women, creating an atmosphere unlike anything the depot had seen before. Colonel Harding stood near the entrance, greeting each arrival with a formal handshake. He had changed from his usual uniform into his dress blues, a sign of respect for the occasion. "Quite a turnout, Private," he commented, as Ace passed by with a tray of bread. "Your idea has struck a chord." "It wasn't just my idea, sir," Ace replied honestly. "Everyone helped." Emmy, still weak but conscious, was wheeled in by Helen and seated near the heater. She wore a clean dress borrowed from one of the nurses, and her hair was tied back with a ribbon. Though pale, her eyes were bright with excitement. "So many people," she whispered to Ace when he brought her a cup of tea. "And no one looks afraid." "No reason to be afraid," he said, smiling. "Just folks sharing a meal together." When everyone was seated, Colonel Harding stood to speak. The room quieted immediately. "Friends," he began, looking around the gathering, "we come together tonight in the spirit of gratitude and community. In times of war, it's easy to forget our common humanity, easy to see only enemies and allies, us and them. But tonight reminds us that beneath those labels we are all just people, with the same hopes, the same fears, the same capacity for kindness." He raised his cup. "To kindness that crosses all boundaries." "To kindness," echoed the gathering, raising their cups as well. The chaplain said a simple blessing, and then the meal began. Servers brought out steaming bowls of fish stew, plates of bread, and the fresh vegetables from the Peterson farm. Despite rationing, there was plenty for everyone, a small miracle of loaves and fishes created by the community's generosity. As they ate, conversation flowed freely. The Japanese women, initially reserved, gradually joined in, encouraged by the friendly atmosphere. They shared stories of their homes, their families, and their hopes for when the war would end. "My husband is fisherman," Hannah explained to Mr. Peterson. "Maybe someday we return to America, start new boat." "You'd be welcome," Peterson replied, sincerely. "We've missed our Japanese neighbors." After the main course, Martha Whitfield's apple pies were served to appreciative murmurs. As people lingered over dessert, the chaplain began to sing a hymn. Others joined in, and soon the room filled with harmony. When the song ended, Emmy asked softly if she might sing a Japanese hymn. The chaplain nodded encouragingly, and she began a melody that was somehow both foreign and familiar, the same tune they had heard at Thanksgiving, but with all the verses now. Her clear voice filled the room, the Japanese words flowing like water. Though most couldn't understand the lyrics, the meaning was clear in Emmy's expression, and the reverent hush that fell over the gathering. When she finished, There was a moment of perfect silence before the chaplain spoke. "Music truly is the language of the soul," he said. "No translation needed." As the evening continued, Emmy reached into a small pocket hidden in her borrowed dress and pulled out a tiny pouch made from what looked like silk brocade. "For you," she said, pressing it into Ace's hand. "I make from lining of kimono, only thing I save from ship." Ace was speechless. The pouch was exquisitely made, with tiny, perfect stitches creating a pattern of cranes in flight. "I can't take this," he protested. "It's your only keepsake." "Please," Emmy insisted. "To remember, you save my life." Touched beyond words, Ace accepted the gift with a deep bow, the way he had seen the Japanese women do. "Thank you. I'll treasure it always." Across the room, Colonel Harding observed this exchange, visibly moved by the gesture and the bond that had formed between Ace and Emmy. The evening was drawing to a close when the peaceful atmosphere was suddenly shattered. The door burst open with a crash, and boots thundered on the wooden floor. Everyone turned to see a group of military police standing in the entrance, their faces grim. "Colonel Harding," the lead officer said formally, "I have orders from General Simmons regarding the Japanese detainees." The lantern light flickered as a cold draft swept through the open door, casting long shadows across the suddenly silent room. The warm glow of the evening shattered as military police officers filed into the mess hall. Their polished boots thundered on the wooden floor, and their stern faces cut through the friendly atmosphere like a knife. The lead officer, a captain with cold eyes, stepped forward. "Colonel Harding," he said crisply, "I have orders from General Simmons to inspect the handling of enemy alien detainees at this facility." Harding moved to meet him, his back straight, and his voice calm. "Captain Marshall, this is unexpected." "Irregularities have been reported, Colonel." The captain's gaze swept over the gathering, soldiers and civilians eating together with the Japanese women. His frown deepened. "I can see the reports were accurate." The townspeople exchanged worried glances. The Japanese women, huddled closer together, their earlier joy replaced by fear. Emmy gripped the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles white. "These women are civilian refugees, not combatants," Harding said. "We've treated them accordingly." Captain Marshall pulled an official document from his coat. "According to my orders, you've violated multiple protocols. Enemy aliens dining with military personnel, a detainee moved to the military infirmary without authorization. This is serious, Colonel." 2 more officers entered, leading a third man between them, Lieutenant Porter. His face was a mix of triumph and shame as he avoided meeting anyone's eyes. "Lieutenant Porter has provided detailed accounts of these violations," Captain Marshall continued, "including the involvement of certain personnel in unauthorized activities." His gaze fixed on Ace, who stood near Emmy's wheelchair. "Private Asa Dalton?" Ace straightened to attention. "Yes, sir. You're under arrest for violation of military protocol and potential security breaches. You will come with us immediately." A shocked murmur ran through the room. Helen stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "If you're arresting Private Dalton, you should arrest me too. I helped move Miss Takahara to the infirmary." "Your name is already on my list, Nurse Price," the captain replied coldly. "As is Dr. Morris for providing treatment without proper authorization." "This is absurd," Dr. Morris protested. "The woman had pneumonia. She would have died without treatment." "That's not for you to decide, Doctor." Captain Marshall turned back to Colonel Harding. "I have orders to prepare all Japanese detainees for immediate transport to Camp Briarwood. They leave at dawn tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Harding's composure cracked slightly. "That's ahead of schedule. The weather is no longer your concern," the captain finished. "These detainees are being removed from your command, effective immediately." Ace felt his heart sink as 2 MPs approached him. Emmy reached out and caught his hand briefly before they pulled him away. "It will be all right," he whispered to her, though he had no right to make such promises. Martha Whitfield stood up, her elderly frame somehow imposing in her indignation. "You should be ashamed," she said clearly to Captain Marshall. "These people have done nothing wrong." "Ma'am, this is a military matter," the captain replied stiffly. "Civilians have no standing here." "We have standing as Americans who believe in decency," Mr. Peterson added, also rising. Several other townspeople murmured agreement, but the captain was unmoved. "Clear the room," he ordered his men. "All civilians are to leave the premises immediately. The detainees will be secured in the East Barracks until transport." As the MPs began escorting Ace toward the door, he caught a last glimpse of the mess hall, the warm lanterns flickering out one by one as the soldiers extinguished them, the Japanese women weeping quietly as they were led away, and Colonel Harding standing alone, his face a mask of controlled fury. Outside in the cold night air, Ace was marched across the muddy yard to a small building that served as the depot's holding cell. It was little more than a shed with a cot and a bucket, but it had a solid lock on the door. "In you go, Private," one of the MPs said, almost apologetically. "Captain's orders." The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, and Ace heard the key turn in the lock. He sat on the narrow cot, listening to the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore and wondering what would happen to Emmy and the others come morning. Pre-dawn darkness wrapped around the small cell. Ace sat alone on the hard cot, listening to the waves and the occasional creaking of the building as wind pushed against its walls. He hadn't slept. His mind kept returning to the scene in the mess hall, the fear in Emmy's eyes, the helpless anger of his friends, the cruel efficiency of the military police. A thin gray light began to seep through the single small window. Morning was coming, and with it the dreaded transport of the women to Camp Briarwood. Ace paced the tiny space, frustrated by his powerlessness. 4 steps one way, turn, 4 steps back. Outside he heard voices, soldiers beginning their morning duties. From his window he could just see the yard between buildings. Soldiers walked back and forth, carrying equipment. A truck idled near the East Barracks, exhaust creating white clouds in the cold air. The door to his cell opened suddenly, and Helen slipped inside. She looked tired, her usually neat hair escaping from its pins, but her eyes were clear and determined. "Helen, how did you—" "Bribe the guard with coffee," she said quickly. "I don't have much time." "Are you under arrest too?" She shook her head. "Not yet. Captain Marshall is still sorting through paperwork. It's buying us some time." "What about the women? Are they really being transported today?" Helen's face tightened with worry. "They're preparing now. Ace, that camp isn't ready for them. I've seen the reports. No proper heating, minimal medical facilities. With Emmy's condition—" She didn't finish the thought. "We have to stop it," Ace said, his hands clenching into fists. "That's why I'm here. I've spoken to Colonel Harding. He's troubled by these orders. I showed him Emmy's medical chart. She's still far too weak for transport." "Will he help?" Helen hesitated. "He's torn. He's a military man, Ace. Following orders is in his blood. But he's also a decent human being." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the railroad letter Ace had found. "I reminded him about this, about the real reason for the rush. He's locked himself in his office with the military code books and regulations. What's he looking for? A loophole, I think. Some way to countermand the orders legally." Helen glanced over her shoulder at the open door. "I need to go before they realize I'm here, but don't give up hope yet. Harding might surprise us all." After Helen left, Ace returned to his vigil by the window. The sky brightened slowly, revealing heavy clouds that promised more rain. Perfect weather for pneumonia to worsen, he thought grimly. Through his window, he spotted Colonel Harding walking across the yard toward the East Barracks. The older man moved stiffly, his face set in deep lines of concentration. He carried a book under one arm. Regulations, perhaps. For a brief moment, Harding paused and looked toward the holding cell. Though he couldn't possibly see Ace through the tiny window, it felt as if their eyes met across the distance. Then the colonel continued on his way. Hours passed. Ace heard the mess hall bell ring for breakfast, though no food was brought to him. Through his window, he watched soldiers going about their duties. The truck near the East Barracks remained, waiting. Around mid-morning, the cell door opened again. This time it was Dr. Morris who entered, carrying his medical bag. "Thought you might need checking," the doctor said gruffly. "Sit down, let me look at you." As he pretended to examine Ace, the doctor spoke in a low voice. "Nurse Price asked me to update you. Harding's found something in the regulations about transport of ill detainees. He's locked in a radio debate with headquarters." "What about Emmy?" Ace asked anxiously. "Still weak, but stable. I've done everything I can to document her condition as being too fragile for transport. Whether that makes any difference?" The doctor shrugged. "And the others?" "Scared. But the townspeople haven't abandoned them. Martha Whitfield is outside the gates right now, leading what amounts to a small protest. She's brought half the town with her." A spark of hope flared in Ace's chest. "Really?" Dr. Morris nodded, a reluctant smile crossing his face. "Never underestimate a determined church lady. They're demanding the women be allowed to stay until proper accommodations are prepared at the new camp." The doctor finished his pretend examination and stood. "Keep your chin up, son. This isn't over yet." After Dr. Morris left, Ace felt slightly better. Maybe there was still hope. If Colonel Harding could find a legal way to delay the transport, if the townspeople continued their support, if Emmy could just have more time to recover. The storm returned in the afternoon, rain pelting against the small window of his cell. Ace could barely see across the yard now, but he thought he detected movement near the East Barracks, soldiers in rain gear, perhaps preparing for the transport despite the weather. As darkness began to fall, the cell door opened once more. This time it was a young private with a tray of food. "Thought you might be hungry," the boy said, setting down the tray. He couldn't have been more than 18, with freckles scattered across his nose. "Thanks," Ace replied. "Any news?" The private glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Colonel's still in his office. Been there all day with those regulation books. Captain Marshall's getting impatient. Says they're leaving at dawn tomorrow no matter what." "And the women?" "They're okay. That older one, Mrs. Whitfield, she brought them more blankets and hot soup. Captain tried to turn her away, but she said—" The private lowered his voice to imitate Martha's stern tones. "Young man, I was serving soup to the needy while you were still in diapers. Now step aside." Despite everything, Ace found himself grinning. "Sounds like Mrs. Whitfield." "She's something, all right." The private headed for the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, a lot of us think what you did was right. Standing up for that sick lady and all." "Thank you," Ace said simply. Alone again, Ace ate the simple meal of bread and stew. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and rain hammered against the roof. He thought about Emmy and the others, hoping they were warm enough in the drafty barracks. As night deepened, Ace lay on the hard cot, listening to the storm. Despite his worry, exhaustion eventually pulled him into a fitful sleep. He dreamed of his mother's farm in Nebraska, of sunshine and open fields, and the smell of fresh bread. In the dream, Emmy was there too, healthy and smiling, hanging laundry on a line while children played nearby. He was jerked awake by the sound of his cell door opening. Colonel Harding stood there, a lantern in his hand, casting strange shadows across his tired face. Outside, it was still dark. "Sir?" Ace sat up quickly. "Private Dalton." Harding's voice was formal, but not unkind. "I've spent the day studying regulations, codes, and humanitarian guidelines." Ace held his breath, afraid to hope. "I found evidence," Harding continued, "that the transfer order violates federal protections for non-combatant detainees, specifically the provision that they must be housed in suitable conditions with adequate medical care." "Does that mean—" "It means I have grounds for a counterorder." Harding's expression was grim but determined. "Whether it will be accepted is another matter. Captain Marshall answers to General Simmons, who seems very eager to please his railroad executive friends." "You're risking your career," Ace realized. "Perhaps." Harding raised the lantern higher, studying Ace's face. "Tell me, Private, why did you do it? Why risk everything for these women, these strangers?" Ace thought for a moment. "Because they're people, sir. Not just detainees or enemy aliens. People who needed help when they had no one else to turn to." He paused. "My mother always taught me that how we treat those who can't help themselves shows who we really are." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." Harding nodded slowly. "Get some rest, Private. Tomorrow will be challenging." As the colonel turned to leave, Ace called after him. "Sir, thank you." Harding didn't reply, but his shoulders straightened slightly as he walked away, the lantern light bobbing in the darkness. Morning came with soft but steady rain. From his cell window, Ace watched soldiers moving through the mist that clung to the ground. The truck still waited near the East Barracks, its metal sides gleaming with moisture. He had no way of knowing what Colonel Harding had decided, or whether the counterorder had been accepted. All he could do was wait and hope. Inside his small office, Colonel Harding sat at his desk, surrounded by open books and scattered papers. He'd been there since before dawn, comparing regulations, checking precedents, drafting and redrafting his counterorder. His silver hair was rumpled from running his hands through it, and his eyes were red from lack of sleep. Before him lay two documents side by side, the original transfer order from General Simmons and his own counterorder, newly signed. Between them was the letter from the railroad executive that Ace had found, the evidence of improper influence. Harding picked up his counterorder and read it once more, checking every word, every regulation cited. It was as solid as he could make it. The transfer violated humanitarian guidelines for several reasons: the women's health, especially Emmy's, the unfinished state of Camp Briarwood, and the harsh winter weather conditions. As he considered his next move, there was a knock at his door. "Enter," he called. Helen Price stepped in, her uniform crisp despite the early hour. "Sir, Captain Marshall is gathering his men. They're preparing to move the women within the hour." Harding nodded grimly. "Thank you, Nurse Price." After she left, Harding sat motionless for several long minutes. The choice before him was stark. If he submitted the counterorder, he would directly challenge a superior officer's command. At best, it would mean the end of his career advancement. At worst, he might face court-martial himself. If he did nothing, those women, especially Emmy, would face a dangerous journey and potentially deadly conditions. And he would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. In the East Barracks, the 6 Japanese women sat close together on their bunks, holding hands in a circle of silent prayer. They had been told to prepare for transport, to gather their few belongings. Rain drummed on the metal roof above them, a constant reminder of the harsh journey ahead. Emmy had been brought back from the infirmary the previous evening, still weak but no longer in immediate danger. She sat wrapped in blankets, leaning against Hana for support. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and resigned. "We will be strong," Hana said softly in Japanese. "Together." The others nodded. After all they had endured, the war, the sinking of their ship, the days adrift at sea, they would face this new challenge with the same quiet dignity. Outside the barracks, Martha Whitfield and several other townspeople had gathered, despite the rain. They stood in a small group, holding umbrellas and thermoses of hot coffee. MPs kept them away from the building, but their presence was a visible statement of support. "We'll write to you," Martha called through the rain. "We'll make sure you're treated properly." Inside his cell, Ace could no longer see the East Barracks from his window. The angle was wrong and the mist too thick. But he could hear activity. Vehicles starting, orders being called, the squeak of wet boots on wooden steps. He paced his tiny cell, 4 steps each way, his mind racing. What was happening out there? Had Harding submitted his counter-order? Would it make any difference? Back in his office, Colonel Harding made his decision. He stood up, tucked the counter-order into his breast pocket, and placed his cap squarely on his head. His face showed no emotion as he walked out into the rain toward the East Barracks. Soldiers snapped to attention as he passed. Captain Marshall stood on the barracks steps, issuing orders to his men. He turned with a frown as Harding approached. "Colonel, we're proceeding with the transport as scheduled." "A moment of your time first, Captain." Harding's voice was perfectly calm. "In private, if you please." The 2 officers stepped aside, standing under the narrow overhang of the barracks roof. Rain fell in sheets around them as Harding pulled out his counter-order. "What's this?" Marshall asked, not taking the offered paper. "A counter-order, Captain, based on federal regulations regarding the humane treatment of civilian detainees." Marshall's face darkened. "You're overstepping, Colonel. My orders come directly from General Simmons." "As do mine," Harding replied evenly. "But the general may not be aware of certain provisions in the federal code." He tapped the document, specifically those regarding medical conditions and appropriate facilities. "This is highly irregular." "Perhaps, but it is legal." Harding's voice hardened slightly. "And morally necessary." For a long moment, the 2 officers stared at each other, neither willing to back down. Around them, soldiers and townspeople watched in tense silence, rain soaking them all. Finally, Marshall spoke. "I'll need to confirm this with headquarters." "Of course," Harding nodded. "In the meantime, the transport will be delayed." Marshall scowled, but gave a curt nod before stalking off toward the communications building, Harding's counter-order clutched in his hand. Inside the East Barracks, the Japanese women listened to this exchange with growing hope. Though they couldn't understand all the words, they recognized that something important had happened. "Colonel is helping us?" Suki asked in halting English. "I think so," Emmy replied softly. "He is good man, like H-san?" Helen Price, who had been checking Emmy's temperature, smiled. "Colonel Harding is a man who believes in doing what's right, even when it's difficult." In his office, Harding waited for the response from headquarters. He sat ramrod straight behind his desk, prepared for the storm that would follow his defiance. The signed counter-order felt like a declaration of independence, not from his country, but from blindly following orders that violated his sense of justice. The rain continued to fall steadily as morning turned to afternoon. In the East Barracks, the women waited, their bags packed but untouched. In his cell, Ace strained to hear any news, catching only fragments of conversation from passing soldiers. Finally, as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, there was a commotion outside. Ace pressed his face to the tiny window and saw Captain Marshall marching toward Colonel Harding's office, his expression thunderous. The door to Harding's office burst open without a knock. Marshall stood in the doorway, his uniform wet with rain, his face flushed with anger. "This is insubordination, Harding," he shouted, waving a piece of paper. "General Simmons is furious." Harding remained seated, his calm a stark contrast to Marshall's rage. "What did the general say, exactly?" Marshall thrust the paper onto Harding's desk. "See for yourself. Your counter-order is rejected. The transport proceeds at dawn tomorrow." Harding read the message slowly, his expression unchanging. Then he looked up at Marshall with steady eyes. "Tomorrow, you say? Not today?" "The roads are too dangerous with this rain. Even the general isn't foolish enough to risk military vehicles in these conditions." Marshall's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You've bought your precious detainees one more night, Colonel. I hope it was worth the black mark on your record." After Marshall stormed out, Harding sat alone, staring at the rejection notice. He hadn't expected to win, not really. But he had hoped for more time. Time for Emmy to recover further, time for better weather, time to find another solution. One day. That was all he had gained with his act of defiance. One more day to make a difference. With a decisive movement, Harding signed the counter-order with a steady hand, committing to his choice of conscience over blind obedience. Mid-morning the next day, the rain had softened to a misty drizzle. The sky remained heavy with clouds, but at least the driving downpour had stopped. Puddles dotted the depot yard, reflecting the gray sky like scattered mirrors. MPs began moving the Japanese women toward the loading platform, where a truck idled, its engine rumbling in the damp air. The women walked in a tight group, carrying their few possessions in small bundles. They wore the same clothes they had arrived in, now somewhat cleaner thanks to Helen's help, but still inadequate for the mountain journey ahead. Emmy was bundled tightly in a coat borrowed from one of the nurses. Her face was pale, and she leaned heavily on Hana's arm. Though her pneumonia had improved, she was still weak, her breathing labored with even the slightest exertion. From his cell window, Ace watched helplessly as the small procession crossed the yard. His hands gripped the window ledge so hard his knuckles turned white. Despite Colonel Harding's efforts, the transport was proceeding as ordered. Soldiers lined the path to the platform, their expressions mixed, some angry, some sympathetic, some simply blank with the practiced neutrality of men following orders. Among them stood the townspeople who had refused to leave, including Martha Whitfield, her gray head bare to the mist as she watched with sorrowful eyes. As the women passed, Martha stepped forward, ignoring the warning from a nearby MP. She pressed a small Bible into Suki's hands. "For strength," she whispered. "We won't forget you." Suki bowed deeply, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for kindness." Helen Price walked alongside the women, carrying her medical bag. She had insisted on accompanying them at least to the platform, to check Emmy one last time before the journey. "Try to keep her warm," Helen instructed Hana quietly. "Make sure she drinks plenty of water and takes these." She slipped a packet of medicine into Hana's pocket. "It's not much, but it might help." "Thank you," Hana replied, her eyes conveying what words could not: gratitude, fear, resignation. Captain Marshall supervised the loading from the platform, his face set in lines of grim satisfaction. The counter-order might have delayed him by a day, but he was completing his mission nonetheless. Colonel Harding was nowhere to be seen. After his failed attempt to stop the transfer, he had retreated to his office, where he remained behind closed doors. Or so everyone thought. Inside his office, Harding was not idle. He sat at his desk, a radio transmitter before him, speaking in urgent tones to someone on the other end. Maps and documents were spread across his desk. Transport routes, weather reports, and a dog-eared copy of military regulations with several pages marked. "Yes, sir, I understand the risks," he was saying, "but I believe this falls under my authority as base commander. The welfare of non-combatant detainees is explicitly covered in Section 12, Paragraph 4. There was a pause as he listened to the response. His face tightened, but his voice remained steady. With all due respect, sir, I cannot in good conscience comply with an order that places civilian lives at unnecessary risk. I am prepared to accept full responsibility for my actions. Another pause, longer this time. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your understanding. I'll proceed as discussed. Harding switched off the radio and sat motionless for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he stood, straightened his uniform, and picked up a document from his desk, a new counter-order, freshly signed and bearing an official stamp. At the loading platform, the women were being helped onto the truck. The wooden benches inside offered no comfort for the long journey ahead. Blankets were piled in one corner, but they looked thin and inadequate against the mountain cold. Emmy climbed the steps slowly, each movement clearly painful. As she settled onto a bench, her face momentarily creased with a coughing fit. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, and when she lowered it, Helen noticed with alarm that it was spotted with blood. "This is insane," Helen protested to Captain Marshall. "She needs a hospital, not a freezing camp in the mountains." "Not my concern, Nurse Price," Marshall replied coldly. "Step back now. They're leaving." The driver started the engine, its rumble drowning out the quiet weeping of some of the women. Emmy closed her eyes, gathering her strength for what was to come. Her lips moved silently, perhaps in prayer. As the truck prepared to depart, Emmy whispered Ace's name, a soft sound almost lost in the engine's noise. She hadn't been allowed to say goodbye to him. None of them had. It was one more small cruelty in a world that seemed determined to separate people rather than bring them together. The driver shifted gears, and the truck lurched forward slightly. Captain Marshall nodded in satisfaction, checking his watch as if to record the exact time of departure. But before the truck could move more than a few inches, a commanding voice cut through the engine noise. "Halt! This transport is canceled by direct order." Everyone turned to see Colonel Harding striding across the yard toward the platform, his face set in determined lines, a document held high in his hand. Behind him came several soldiers, including Dr. Morris, and, to everyone's surprise, a freed Ace Dalton. The intervention had begun. Colonel Harding's voice carried across the depot yard with the authority of absolute certainty. "Halt this transport immediately." He reached the platform in long strides, the counter-order held high in his hand. Captain Marshall's face darkened with anger. "What is the meaning of this, Colonel? We have our orders. And now you have new ones." Harding handed the document to Marshall. "Direct from General Simmons's office, countermanding the transport order." Marshall snatched the paper and scanned it quickly, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief. "This is impossible. I spoke to the general myself yesterday." "And I spoke to his superior this morning," Harding replied calmly. "The adjutant general agrees that transporting civilians, especially ill ones, to an unfinished facility violates both military protocol and federal law. The soldiers and townspeople watching this confrontation held their breath. On the truck, the Japanese women sat very still, afraid to hope, but unable to look away. Furthermore," Harding continued, "I've received confirmation that Camp Briarwood won't be ready for occupancy for at least 3 more weeks. The recent storms have delayed construction significantly." Marshall's face had gone pale, then red with embarrassment. "I wasn't informed of these developments." "Perhaps because certain parties were more concerned with railroad timetables than human welfare," Harding suggested, his voice just quiet enough that only Marshall could hear the accusation. For a moment, it seemed the captain might argue further, but military discipline won out. With visible reluctance, he folded the counter-order and tucked it into his pocket. Very well, Colonel. What are your orders regarding the detainees? They will remain under my command at this facility until suitable accommodation is prepared elsewhere. Harding's tone made it clear the matter was settled. Driver, shut down the engine. Sergeant, help these women back to their quarters. As the engine died, a collective sigh seemed to pass through the witnesses. Martha Whitfield pressed her hands together in a gesture of thanks, while Dr. Morris allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Ace, standing slightly behind Harding, caught sight of Emmy on the truck. Their eyes met across the distance, and though neither could speak, their expressions said everything: relief, joy, gratitude. The MPs, now taking orders from Harding rather than Marshall, began helping the women down from the truck. Emmy was the last to descend, her movements slow and painful. When she reached the bottom step, her strength gave out, and she swayed dangerously. Ace was there in an instant, catching her before she could fall. He lifted her gently, cradling her as if she weighed nothing. "I've got you," he murmured. "You're safe now." Emmy's eyes filled with tears as she recognized him. "Asa-san," she whispered. "You... free?" Colonel Harding sorted everything out, he explained, carrying her away from the truck. "Nobody's going to that mountain camp." Captain Marshall watched this scene with barely concealed fury. He approached Harding once more, keeping his voice low. "This isn't over, Colonel. General Simmons won't be pleased with your interference." "I'm sure he won't," Harding agreed mildly, "but I'm equally sure he'll prefer a minor administrative headache to the scandal of civilian deaths due to negligence, especially when the press gets hold of the story." He nodded toward the small group of townspeople, who were now helping the women gather their belongings. "Mrs. Whitfield there has connections at the San Francisco Chronicle. A story about sick women being sent to an unfinished camp in winter would make quite the headline, don't you think?" Marshall had no reply to this. With a curt nod, he turned on his heel and stalked away, his men following behind him. As the captain and his MPs departed, the tension in the air dissolved like mist in sunshine. Soldiers and townspeople alike broke into smiles, some even cheering quietly. Helen rushed to check on Emmy, who still rested in Ace's arms, her head against his shoulder. "Let's get her to the infirmary," Helen said, touching Emmy's forehead. "She's burning up again." Ace nodded and began walking toward the medical building, his steps careful but quick. As they crossed the yard, Colonel Harding fell into step beside them. "How is she?" he asked quietly. "Fever's back," Helen replied. "The stress was too much for her weakened system." Harding's face showed genuine concern. "Do whatever you need to, Nurse Price. No more regulations standing in your way." "Thank you, sir." Helen's voice caught slightly. "For everything." "Don't thank me yet," Harding warned. "Captain Marshall isn't the type to admit defeat easily. We may have won this battle, but the war isn't over." Ace looked down at Emmy's face, pale against his uniform jacket. "At least we've bought some time," he said. "Time for her to heal properly." "Indeed," Harding nodded. "And perhaps time for wiser heads to prevail." They had reached the infirmary. As Helen hurried ahead to prepare a bed, Harding placed a hand on Ace's shoulder. "You did well, Private. Standing up for what's right, even at personal cost. That's the kind of soldier, the kind of man America needs." "Just did what anyone would do, sir," Ace replied, embarrassed by the praise. "No," Harding said firmly. "Not anyone. Too few, in fact." He glanced back toward where the truck had been. "Now get her inside before she catches a new chill. That's an order." "Yes, sir." Ace smiled and carried Emmy into the warmth of the infirmary, his heart lighter than it had been in days. The intervention had succeeded, at least for now. The women were safe, Emmy would receive proper care, and somehow, against all odds, They had managed to stand up against injustice and win. It was, Ace thought, a small miracle, the kind that happens when good people refuse to look away from suffering, when they choose compassion over convenience, humanity over blind obedience. As he gently laid Emmy on the infirmary bed, her eyes opened. She smiled weakly and whispered something in Japanese that he couldn't understand. But her meaning was clear enough in the way she gripped his hand. Gratitude too deep for words in any language. The infirmary was quiet, except for the crackling of the fire in the small stove. Ace sat beside Emmy's bed, watching her breathe. Helen had given her medicine to bring down the fever, and now she slept peacefully, her face relaxed for the first time in days. Outside, the clouds had finally broken, allowing weak winter sunlight to filter through the windows. It cast golden patches on the white infirmary floor, like islands of warmth in a sea of sterility. The door opened, and Helen entered with a tray of tea. She handed a cup to Ace before checking Emmy's temperature with a practiced hand. "Better," she announced with satisfaction. "The fever's coming down." "Thank God," Ace murmured, sipping the hot tea gratefully. "Thank modern medicine," Helen corrected with a smile. "And Colonel Harding's intervention." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, both tired from the day's events but too keyed up to rest. "What happens now?" Ace finally asked. "Captain Marshall won't just give up." Helen's smile faded. "No, he won't. But Harding bought us time, and that's what we needed most." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Morris entered, followed by the 6 Japanese women from the barracks. They had changed into clean clothes, simple dresses donated by the townswomen, and carried small bundles in their hands. "They insisted on seeing her," Dr. Morris explained with a shrug. "Couldn't turn them away." The women approached Emmy's bed quietly, their faces showing both concern and hope. Hana, the oldest, placed a small origami crane on the bedside table. "For healing," she explained to Ace in halting English. "Old belief, 1,000 cranes bring wish true." "It's beautiful," Ace said sincerely, touching the delicate paper creation. Suki added another crane next to the first. "We make more, many more." The other women nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on Emmy's sleeping form. They had been through so much together. The journey from Japan, the torpedoed ship, the lifeboat, and now this strange detention in a foreign land. Their bond was like that of sisters, formed in adversity and strengthened by shared suffering. Emmy's eyes fluttered open at the sound of their voices. For a moment she seemed confused, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room. Then she saw her friends gathered around her bed, and Ace sitting beside her, and her face lit with joy. "Mina," she whispered, using the Japanese word for everyone. Then, in careful English, "You are here. Safe." "Yes," Ace confirmed, taking her hand gently. "Everyone's safe. No one's going to that mountain camp." Emmy's eyes filled with tears of relief. She said something in Japanese to the other women, who responded with smiles and soft words of their own. "She asks if it is true," Hana translated, "if we stay here now." "That's right," Helen said. "Colonel Harding has arranged for you to remain at the depot until proper accommodation can be found, somewhere warm and safe." The women bowed deeply, their gratitude evident in every line of their bodies. Emmy tried to sit up to join them, but Ace gently pressed her back against the pillows. "Rest now," he said. "You need to get your strength back." She nodded, though her eyes remained bright with questions. "The soldiers? Who took you away?" "Military police," Ace explained. "But it's okay now. Colonel Harding sorted everything out." "He is good man," Emmy said firmly. "Like you." Ace felt his face grow warm at the comparison. He's a lot braver than me. He risked his whole career to help you. No, Emmy shook her head slightly. You first to help. When no one else see us as people, you see. You bring soup, blankets, you care. The other women nodded in agreement. Suki stepped forward and placed a hand on Ace's shoulder. We pray for you, she said simply. When they take you away, we pray God protect good man. Dr. Morris, who had been checking Emmy's chart, cleared his throat gruffly. All right, that's enough excitement for now. My patient needs rest, and so do the rest of you. You can visit again tomorrow. The women reluctantly prepared to leave, each touching Emmy's hand or smoothing her blanket in small gestures of affection. As they filed out, Hannah paused beside Ace. We never forget, she said softly. What you do for us. Never. After they left, the room seemed emptier somehow, despite the clutter of medical equipment. Emmy's eyes were growing heavy with the effects of the medicine, but she fought to keep them open. Sleep, Ace encouraged. I'll be here when you wake up. Promise? She murmured, already drifting. Promise, he assured her, still holding her hand. Her fingers relaxed in his as she slipped into healing sleep. Ace continued to sit beside her, watching over her rest with a sense of profound relief. Against all odds, they had won a victory, not just for Emmy and the other women, but for the principle that compassion should outweigh convenience, that rules should serve humanity rather than the other way around. Outside the infirmary window, the last of the rain clouds were breaking up, revealing patches of blue sky. Soldiers went about their duties in the yard, stopping occasionally to chat with the townspeople who still lingered, reluctant to leave until they were certain the crisis had truly passed. Colonel Harding emerged from his office and walked toward the chapel, his posture straight, but his step lighter than it had been in days. The weight of a difficult decision had been lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the certainty that he had done the right thing, regardless of the professional consequences. The group walked back toward the depot chapel as the storm clouds finally broke, allowing sunlight to warm the wet ground and raise steam from the puddles. It felt like a sign, a small hope breaking through after days of darkness. Inside the chapel, Harding gathered the soldiers, the townspeople, and the Japanese women. His face was solemn but peaceful as he addressed them all. Today, we've been reminded of something important, he said, his voice carrying to the rafters, that our common humanity transcends the divisions of war and politics, that compassion is not a weakness but a strength. He looked around at the gathering, Americans and Japanese, military and civilian, all joined in a moment of unexpected unity. I have declared this depot temporarily a humanitarian zone, he continued. This is fully within Army authority and will ensure that Miss Takahara and her companions will remain under protection until suitable arrangements can be made for their welfare. A murmur of approval ran through the assembly. Martha Whitfield nodded firmly, as if she had expected nothing less. The Japanese women bowed deeply, their faces showing both relief and gratitude. It won't be easy, Harding warned. There will be opposition, but I believe we are on the right side of both law and morality. As the gathering broke up, people stopped to shake Harding's hand or express their support. The colonel accepted their thanks with modest grace, deflecting praise with the skill of a natural leader. Ace watched from the infirmary window, Emmy's hand still held gently in his. He felt something he hadn't felt since the war began, a sense of rightness, of purpose beyond the grim business of fighting. We did it, he whispered to the sleeping Emmy. We really did it. And though she couldn't hear him, her face seemed to relax into a peaceful smile, as if even in sleep she knew that, for now at least, she was safe among friends. The chapel interior glowed with warmth from the small wood stove in the corner. polished wooden pews reflected the light from oil lamps hanging from the rafters. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving a crisp, clear afternoon in its wake. Colonel Harding stood at the front of the chapel, his uniform pressed and his silver hair neatly combed. Before him sat the Japanese women, the depot staff, and several townspeople who had refused to leave until they were certain the women were safe. The only one missing was Emmy, still recovering in the infirmary under Helen's care. "I've called you all here," Harding began, his voice steady and sure, "to make an official announcement. As of this morning, I have declared this depot temporarily a humanitarian zone under Article 27 of the Geneva Convention." A murmur ran through the gathering. Captain Marshall, standing stiffly at the back of the chapel, frowned deeply. "This designation," Harding continued, ignoring Marshall's glare, "is fully within my authority as base commander. It ensures that our guests," he nodded towards the Japanese women, "will remain under our protection until proper accommodations can be prepared elsewhere." "Sir," Captain Marshall stepped forward, "General Simmons may not approve." "General Simmons has already been informed," Harding cut him off smoothly, "as has his superior, the Adjutant General. They have acknowledged that the transfer order was issued without full awareness of the conditions at Camp Briarwood." Marshall's face flushed red, but he said nothing more. Harding turned to address the Japanese women directly. "Ladies, you will remain here until we can guarantee your safety and comfort elsewhere. Nurse Price will continue to oversee your medical needs, and Private Dalton will ensure you have proper meals." The women bowed deeply in response, their faces showing the first real peace since their arrival. Harding then faced the officers who had pushed for the transfer. His voice grew stern, but remained controlled. "I have also discovered evidence of improper influence in the issuing of the transfer order, specifically pressure from certain railroad interests to clear this facility for commercial use." He held up the letter Ace had found. "This correspondence clearly shows that humanitarian considerations were set aside in favor of business interests. That is unacceptable under military law and my personal code of ethics." The officers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. Captain Marshall looked as if he might protest, but thought better of it when he saw the determined set of Harding's jaw. "That will be all," Harding concluded. "You are dismissed to your duties." As the officers filed out, the townspeople surrounded Harding, expressing their support and relief. Martha Whitfield clasped his hand in both of hers. "God bless you, Colonel," she said fervently. "You've done a righteous thing today." "Just doing my duty, ma'am," he replied, though the lines around his eyes softened at her praise. Ace stood near the Japanese women, watching this scene with a sense of wonder. Just days ago, these same women had been viewed with suspicion and fear. Now they were being embraced by the community as people deserving of protection and care. Hana, the oldest of the women, approached him with a small bow. "Thank you," she said simply. "You begin this. Your kindness first spark." "Just did what was right," Ace replied, embarrassed by her gratitude. "Not everyone see right thing," Hana said wisely, "or have courage to do it." Before Ace could respond, Dr. Morris entered the chapel, his medical bag in hand. "Miss Takahara is asking for you, Private," he said. "Her fever's down, and she's more alert." With a quick nod to Hana, Ace hurried to the infirmary. Inside, he found Emmy propped up on pillows, her black hair neatly combed and her cheeks showing a touch of healthy color. Helen sat beside her, helping her sip broth from a cup. "Ace-san," Emmy greeted him, her voice stronger than before. "Good news?" "The best," he confirmed, taking the chair Helen offered him. "Colonel Harding has declared the depot a humanitarian zone. You're all staying here, where it's safe and warm." Emmy's face lit up with relief. "The others? They are well?" They're fine, Ace assured her. Getting settled in the chapel for now, where it's warmer than the barracks. The townspeople have brought more blankets and clothes. Helen set down the empty cup and checked Emmy's pulse. Your friends will be able to visit tomorrow if you keep improving, she told her, but for now you need rest. I rest, Emmy agreed, though her eyes stayed fixed on Ace. But first, must say thank you. For everything. You don't need to thank me, Ace said softly. Yes, Emmy insisted. In my country, we say, on receiving a favor, inscribe it on stone. On giving a favor, inscribe it on water. I never forget what you do for me, for all of us. Her simple words touched Ace deeply. He had been raised to believe that helping others was just what decent folks did, not something that required recognition or thanks. But Emmy's gratitude, and the quiet dignity with which she expressed it, made him realize how profound their connection had become through these difficult days. As he left the infirmary, Ace found Colonel Harding waiting outside. How is she? Harding asked. Getting stronger, Ace replied. Dr. Morris thinks she'll be up and about in a few days. Good, good. Harding nodded, then hesitated. Private, I want to thank you personally. Your actions, while technically against regulations, reminded me of something important. That rules exist to serve humanity, not the other way around. Ace wasn't sure how to respond to this unexpected praise from his commanding officer. Just did what my ma taught me, sir. To stand up for folks who need help. Your mother raised a fine man. Harding clapped him on the shoulder. Now, I believe the kitchen needs your expertise. We have guests to feed properly for a change. As Ace headed toward the kitchen, his heart felt lighter than it had in months. The women bowed deeply to Colonel Harding before settling into the pews to rest. The imminent danger finally passed. 2 days passed quietly as storms gave way to cold sun, the women slowly regaining strength under the depot's gentle routine. The forced march to the transport truck seemed like a distant nightmare now, replaced by a new sense of security and even cautious friendship. On a clear, crisp morning, Ace balanced a tray of steaming porridge bowls as he knocked on the chapel door. Inside, the Japanese women had created a tidy living space. Their few possessions were neatly arranged, and paper cranes hung from strings near the windows, catching the morning light. Breakfast, Ace announced, setting the tray on a small table. Smells wonderful, Suki said, helping distribute the bowls. You make yourself? Sure did, Ace confirmed. My ma's recipe, oats with cinnamon and a touch of honey. Not fancy, but it sticks to your ribs. The women accepted the food with their customary bows of thanks. They had grown more comfortable around Ace in the days since the failed transport attempt, seeing him not as an enemy soldier, but as a friend who had risked everything for their welfare. How is Emmy this morning? Hannah asked between careful spoonfuls of the hot porridge. Much better, Ace reported happily. Doctor says her lungs are clearing up nicely. She might be able to join you here by tomorrow. This news brought smiles to all the women's faces. Despite the relative comfort of the infirmary, they knew Emmy must be lonely, separated from her companions. After breakfast, Ace collected the empty bowls and headed back to the kitchen. Along the way, he noticed a change in the depot's atmosphere. Soldiers who had once kept their distance from the Japanese women now nodded polite greetings. Some even offered small gifts, a carved wooden spoon, a harmonica missing 2 notes but still playable, a book of simple English poems. In the kitchen, Ace found Mac humming as he kneaded bread dough. The cook had initially been skeptical about the Japanese women, but even he had softened after seeing how they helped clean the mess hall each day without being asked. That Lieutenant Porter left this morning, Mac mentioned as Ace washed the breakfast bowls. Transferred to some desk job up north. Can't say I'm sorry to see him go, Ace admitted. Porter had been the one who reported them to Captain Marshall, nearly causing Emmy's death through his strict adherence to regulations. "Reckon he did us all a favor in the end," Mac mused. "If he hadn't kicked up such a fuss, Colonel might never have taken a stand. Funny how things work out sometimes." Later that day, Ace brought a bowl of chicken soup to Emmy in the infirmary. He found her sitting up in bed, carefully folding a square of colored paper into a crane. "Another one for the collection?" he asked, setting the soup on her bedside table. "Yes," she said with a small smile. 987 now, almost to 1,000. "What will you wish for when you reach 1,000? Ace was curious if her answer would be the same as before. Emmy considered the question seriously. "First, I think peace. Now—" She looked up at him, her dark eyes clear and direct. "Now I wish for understanding, between your people and mine, so no more war." "That's a mighty fine wish," Ace said, touched by her wisdom. "Better than wishing the war had never happened, I reckon." "Cannot change past," Emmy agreed. "Only future." Helen entered, carrying fresh bandages. "Time to change your dressing," she told Emmy. "And then I want you to try standing for a few minutes. We need to get you moving a little each day." Ace excused himself while Helen helped Emmy with her bandages. He returned to the chapel, where he had promised to help the women move their bedding to sunnier spots. The chapel had become more than just shelter. It was a temporary home where they could begin to heal from their ordeal. As days passed, Emmy grew stronger. By the end of the week, she could walk short distances with help. Ace often supported her on these brief journeys, her small hand resting on his arm for balance. On a particularly fine afternoon, Emmy asked to go outside for the first time since her illness. Helen agreed, as long as she stayed bundled up and didn't overexert herself. "Just to feel sun," Emmy explained, as Ace wrapped her in a thick coat. "Too long inside." Ace understood. He had grown up on a farm in Nebraska, where open skies and fresh air were as necessary as food and water. Being confined indoors for weeks would have driven him crazy, too. They walked slowly through the depot yard, Emmy leaning on Ace's arm. The winter air was cold but refreshing, carrying the tang of salt from the nearby ocean. Emmy tilted her face up to the sun, closing her eyes in simple pleasure. "Beautiful day," she murmured. "Sure is," Ace agreed, though he was watching her face rather than the sky. The sunlight brought warmth to her cheeks and highlighted the graceful curve of her profile. He realized with a start how much her well-being had come to matter to him in these few weeks. As they reached a bench overlooking the shore, Emmy paused to catch her breath. Ace helped her sit, making sure the bench was dry before she settled on it. "Thank you," she said, "not just for the immediate help, but for everything." Her eyes conveyed what her limited English could not, the depth of her gratitude and growing affection. "You're welcome," Ace replied simply, sitting beside her. They watched the waves together in companionable silence, two people from opposite sides of a terrible war, finding common ground in the simple act of enjoying a beautiful day. It was a small miracle in a world torn apart by conflict, proof that humanity could prevail over hatred if given half a chance. When it was time to return to the infirmary, Emmy took one last look at the ocean. "I remember crossing," she said quietly, "on ship, before torpedo, sky and water so big, make problems seem small. Reckon that's why folks have always looked to the horizon when times are hard," Ace reflected. "Reminds us there's more to life than whatever trouble we're facing right now." Emmy nodded, understanding perfectly. More than war, more than fear, this important to remember. As they walked back, Ace noticed soldiers nodding respectfully to Emmy. Some even offered gentle words of greeting. The barrier of suspicion was crumbling day by day, replaced by the recognition of shared humanity. It wasn't universal. Some men still kept their distance, but it was progress. Back in the infirmary, Emmy settled into her bed with a contented sigh. "Good walk," she said. "Tomorrow, maybe little longer?" "If Dr. Morris approves," Ace agreed. "Don't want to overdo it." "I am stronger than I look," Emmy said with unexpected firmness. "Japanese women not weak." "I never thought you were," Ace assured her, smiling at her determination. "Just want you healthy is all." Her expression softened. "I know. You care for everyone, is your nature." As Ace left the infirmary, he reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. The frightened, exhausted women who had arrived at the depot now had names, stories, and personalities to him. They were no longer faceless enemy aliens, but individuals worthy of respect and compassion. And Emmy, quiet, brave Emmy with her paper cranes and gentle wisdom, had become someone special, someone whose smile could brighten the dreariest day. It was an unexpected gift in the midst of war's darkness, a reminder that human connections transcend the artificial boundaries of conflict. The healing days continued, marked by small victories. Emmy joining the others in the chapel, the women helping in the kitchen, soldiers and townspeople bringing gifts of food and clothing. With each passing day, the depot felt less like a military installation and more like a community. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the chapel windows as Ace helped the women arrange their living space. They had been given cots to replace the pews they had been sleeping on, making the chapel more comfortable for extended stay. "Mail wagon," someone shouted from outside. Ace looked up, surprised. The coastal roads had been nearly impassable for days due to mudslides from the recent storms. The arrival of mail was an unexpected treat. "I'll go see if there's anything for you ladies," he told the women, who nodded gratefully. They had received no news from the outside world since their ship was torpedoed. The mail wagon had drawn a crowd of soldiers, all eager for letters from home. Ace waited patiently until the initial rush subsided, then approached the clerk. "Anything for the Japanese women?" he asked. The clerk consulted his list. "Actually, yes. Red Cross forwarded these from an internment camp in Idaho. Seems some of their relatives got word they survived the sinking." He handed Ace a small bundle of letters, each bearing official Red Cross markings and security stamps showing they had been read and censored by authorities. Still, they were letters. Connections to the families these women had feared they might never hear from again. When Ace returned to the chapel with the letters, the reaction was immediate and profound. The women gathered around, their faces showing a mixture of hope and anxiety as he distributed the envelopes. "Husband!" Hannah cried, recognizing the handwriting on hers. "He is alive!" Suki pressed her letter to her heart before opening it. "From my sister," she whispered, "in Utah camp." Emmy, now well enough to sit in a comfortable chair near the stove, received her letter last. She opened it with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the characters quickly. Tears began to flow down her cheeks, but her smile told Ace they were tears of joy. "My father," she explained, looking up at Ace, "and mother, safe in Montana camp." The women retreated to their cots to read their letters privately, some weeping quietly, others smiling through tears. The thin paper sheets they held represented something precious beyond words. Proof that despite war and separation, family bonds endured. As Ace watched them, he was struck by a sudden realization. These women were not so different from his own mother back in Nebraska, anxiously awaiting letters from her son at war. Love and worry recognized no national boundaries. Later, as the women shared news from their letters with each other, Ace received his own mail, a thick envelope from home. He sat on the chapel steps to read it, savoring this connection to his family. His mother's familiar handwriting covered several pages, updating him on farm news, his siblings' activities, and community happenings. Near the end, she wrote, "I'm proud of you, son, not just for serving your country, but for staying true to the values we raised you with. Remember what your grandpa always said, keep choosing kindness even when it costs, especially when it costs. That's when it matters most." Ace read those words twice, struck by how perfectly they applied to his recent experiences. His mother couldn't know about Emmy and the other women, about his defiance of military protocol to save a life. Yet somehow, she had sent exactly the guidance he needed. That evening, as the women gathered for supper in the mess hall, Ace shared parts of his mother's letter with them. He translated her homespun wisdom into simpler English they could understand, watching their faces as they absorbed her words about kindness. "Your mother very wise," Hana commented. "Like Japanese saying, one kind word can warm 3 winter months." "Reckon our folks might get along just fine if politicians let them," Ace observed. "Seems mothers have the same wisdom the world over." After supper, Emmy asked if she could write a reply to her parents. Ace provided paper and a pencil, then watched as she carefully composed her letter in Japanese characters that were beautiful but mysterious to him. "Will you send?" she asked when she had finished. "Red Cross help letters find way." "Of course," Ace promised. "I'll make sure it gets to them." Emmy hesitated, then added in her careful English, "I tell them about kind American, man who saved my life. They will pray for you." Ace felt his face grow warm at this simple statement. "That's mighty nice of them." "Is truth," Emmy said firmly. She folded the letter and handed it to him, their fingers touching briefly. "Thank you, Acha-san, for everything." That night, Ace lay awake in his bunk, thinking about the letters and what they represented. Connections across vast distances, bridges between separated loved ones. In a world torn apart by conflict, these fragile paper messengers carried something powerful. The assurance that somewhere, someone was waiting, caring, hoping for your safety. It made the war seem smaller somehow, less all-encompassing. Beyond the fighting and fear, ordinary people on both sides loved their families, missed their homes, and longed for peace. It was a comforting thought to carry into sleep. Market day in the nearby village dawned clear and cold. Colonel Harding had authorized a small excursion. Ace, Helen, and 2 of the Japanese women would travel by wagon into town for supplies. It was an unprecedented move, allowing enemy aliens to leave the depot, but Harding had simply said, "They're civilian refugees in our care, not prisoners of war." Emmy and Suki were chosen to go, being the ones who spoke the most English. They dressed in clean clothes donated by townspeople, simple skirts and blouses that helped them blend in rather than stand out. Still, as they climbed into the wagon beside Ace and Helen, their faces showed a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "No need to worry," Ace assured them as he took up the reins. "Folks in town already know about you. Most of them have been mighty supportive." The wagon rumbled down the coastal road, offering beautiful views of the ocean on one side and rolling hills on the other. Emmy and Suki sat close together, taking in the scenery with wide eyes. "So beautiful," Suki murmured, "like Japan coast." "Home must seem very far away," Helen said gently. "Yes," Emmy nodded, "but people here make us feel welcome, not so alone." As they approached the village, the women grew quiet, clearly nervous about how they would be received. The main street was bustling with market day activity, farmers selling produce, shopkeepers displaying wares on sidewalk tables, children running errands for their mothers. Ace pulled the wagon to a stop near the general store. "Ready?" he asked the women. They nodded, straightening their shoulders with quiet dignity. Helen helped them down from the wagon, and together the four of them entered the store. A hush fell as townspeople noticed the Japanese women. For a tense moment, Ace feared they might face hostility. Then Martha Whitfield stepped forward, her face wreathed in smiles. "There you are," she exclaimed, as if greeting old friends. "I've been hoping Colonel Harding would let you visit town." She took Emmy's hand warmly. "How are you feeling, dear? Better now, I hope?" "Much better," Emmy replied, visibly relaxing at this kind welcome. "Thank you for quilts. Keep us warm." "You're very welcome." Martha turned to the curious onlookers. "Folks, these are the ladies I was telling you about, the ones who survived that terrible shipwreck." One by one, the townspeople came forward to greet the women. Some were hesitant at first, but Martha's open acceptance set the tone. Soon, Emmy and Suki were being introduced all around, their initial nervousness giving way to cautious smiles. Mr. Peterson, the hardware store owner, approached with a small wooden box in his hands. "Made you ladies something," he said gruffly, presenting it to Suki. "Nothing fancy, but thought you might like it." Inside the box were 7 delicately carved wooden combs. "My wife's Japanese neighbor showed me how to make these years ago," Peterson explained. "Said every woman needs a proper comb for her hair." Suki's eyes filled with tears as she touched the combs. "Beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." As the morning progressed, more townspeople came forward with small gifts or kind words. Pastor Williams invited them to the Advent service on Sunday. The bookstore owner offered English primers to help them improve their language skills. Mrs. Johnson, who ran the dress shop, donated winter coats for all 7 women. "Can't have you freezing when the real cold comes," she said practically. "These were left from last season, but they're good quality." Ace watched this scene unfold with a full heart. These were the same townspeople who, just months ago, had watched their Japanese neighbors being taken away to internment camps. Some had even supported the evacuation, believing the government's warnings about potential spies and saboteurs. Yet here they were now, embracing Emmy and Suki with genuine warmth and concern. It was as if putting faces to the abstract concept of enemy aliens had dissolved their fear, revealing the common humanity beneath. As they prepared to return to the depot, Pastor Williams approached the wagon. "I've been thinking," he said to Ace. "Those ladies must be missing their own ways of worship. Would they like to join us for a service? Nothing fancy, just singing some hymns, sharing some scripture. Universal things." "I'll ask them," Ace promised, touched by the man's thoughtfulness. On the wagon ride home, Emmy and Suki were transformed, their faces glowing with the simple joy of having been treated with dignity and kindness. They chattered excitedly in Japanese, occasionally translating a particularly memorable moment for Ace and Helen. "Mrs. Baker say her daughter learn origami from Japanese friend," Suki reported. "Want us teach children at school someday." "Pastor invite us to church," Emmy added. "Say God love all people, all nations." As they crested a hill, the late afternoon sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink. The ocean reflected the light, sparkling like scattered diamonds on the water's surface. Emmy fell silent, gazing at the sunset with wonder. "So beautiful," she finally whispered. Ace nodded, equally moved by the sight. "Reckon God paints the prettiest pictures, don't he?" "Yes," Emmy agreed softly. "Same God, same sky. In Japan, in America, same beautiful world." It was a profound observation in its simplicity, a recognition that beneath all the artificial divisions of war, humanity shared one home, one sky, one creator. On the wagon ride home, the sunset paints the sky gold, and Emmy marvels softly at its beauty. Evening shadows lengthened as people gathered in the chapel. Advent candles glowed on the small altar, their flames steady in the still air. The pews had been returned to their proper places for the service, and they filled quickly with soldiers, nurses, the Japanese women, and several townspeople who had come specifically for this special event. Colonel Harding had approved Pastor Williams' request for an Advent service at the depot, open to all who wished to attend. It was another small step toward normalcy and community in a time of war. Ace helped Emmy find a seat near the front. She had regained most of her strength, but still tired easily. Tonight she looked different. Her black hair arranged neatly with one of Mr. Peterson's wooden combs, her borrowed dress clean and pressed for the occasion. "Nervous?" Ace asked, noticing how she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "Little," she admitted. "Long time since church." "Just a simple service," he assured her. "Hymns mostly, maybe a short sermon." The other Japanese women filed in, equally neat and solemn in their borrowed clothes. They had spent the afternoon preparing, clearly understanding the significance of being invited to worship alongside the Americans. Pastor Williams entered last, wearing a simple black suit rather than formal vestments. He carried an old Bible and a small notebook, nothing more. His approach to faith was straightforward and unpretentious, qualities that had endeared him to his congregation. "Friends," he began warmly, "welcome to this Advent service, a time when Christians around the world prepare their hearts for Christmas, remembering the birth of Christ and the hope he brings to all nations." He looked around the chapel, his gaze resting briefly on each face. "Tonight, we have the blessing of worshiping together, people from different lands, different traditions, but united in our humanity and our need for hope in dark times." The service began with familiar carols, O come, Emmanuel," and "Come, thou long-expected Jesus." The soldiers and townspeople sang with the ease of long practice, while the Japanese women listened intently, trying to follow the unfamiliar melodies. Then Pastor Williams announced, "Now, I understand that one of our guests knows a hymn that crosses our cultural boundaries. Miss Takahara, would you honor us by leading that hymn?" Emmy looked startled, then nervously pleased. She stood slowly and moved to the front of the chapel. In a clear voice that gained confidence with each word, she began to sing the same hymn she had hummed at Thanksgiving. "For the beauty of the earth," but this time in Japanese. The melody was immediately recognizable to everyone present. After the first few lines, Pastor Williams began to sing the English words softly, and others joined in. Soon the chapel filled with the sound of the same hymn being sung in two languages simultaneously. Different words, but the same music, the same meaning, the same gratitude for life's blessings. The effect was magical. As the voices blended, something shifted in the atmosphere of the chapel. Barriers that had seemed insurmountable melted away. They were no longer separate groups divided by war and circumstance, but a single gathering united in song and spirit. When the hymn ended, there was a moment of profound silence. Then Pastor Williams spoke quietly. "This is what peace sounds like. Different voices, different languages, creating harmony together." His brief sermon touched on themes of reconciliation and hope, how light shines brightest in darkness, how hardship can reveal the best in human nature, how God's love transcends the artificial boundaries humans create. "In this season of Advent," he concluded, "we are reminded that the greatest gift ever given was one of peace. Peace not just as the absence of conflict, but as the presence of right relationships, with God, with each other, with ourselves." The service closed with another hymn, this one unfamiliar to the Japanese women. But they listened intently, swaying slightly with the rhythm, absorbing the music, if not the words. As people began to leave, many stopped to thank Emmy for her singing. She accepted their praise with characteristic humility, bowing slightly to each person who spoke to her. One grizzled sergeant, who had previously kept his distance from the Japanese women, approached her last. "My mother used to sing that hymn," he said gruffly. "Hearing it in your language, well, it reminded me that music belongs to everyone. Thank you for that." Emmy bowed deeply to him. "Thank you for listening," she replied simply. Outside the chapel, stars filled the clear night sky. The candle flames swayed gently as the final notes lingered in warm silence, a promise of peace made tangible through music. Christmas Eve dawn broke clear and cold over the depot. Frost glittered on the shore like scattered diamonds, and the water lay calm and smooth as glass, reflecting the pale winter sky. After weeks of storms and rain, the peaceful morning felt like a gift. Ace rose early, his breath visible in the cold air of the barracks. He dressed quickly and made his way to the workshop where he'd been spending his free hours for the past week. On a bench lay his project, a small wooden bird, carefully carved and sanded to a silky finish. He picked it up, examining it one last time for any rough edges, then tucked it into his pocket. Outside, he found Helen, Colonel Harding, and the Japanese women already gathered near the chapel. They stood in a loose circle, their faces turned toward the rising sun. "Merry Christmas Eve," Ace called as he joined them. "Merry Christmas," they responded, some in English, some in Japanese, the greeting universally understood. Emmy stood slightly apart, watching the golden light spread across the water. She wore the warm coat Mrs. Johnson had donated, her hair loose around her shoulders. The weeks of proper food and care had restored her health, and though still slender, she no longer looked fragile. "Beautiful morning," Ace said, moving to stand beside her. "Yes," she agreed. "Perfect for new beginning." "New beginning?" Emmy nodded toward Colonel Harding, who was unfolding an official-looking document. "He received news yesterday. Tell us this morning." Harding cleared his throat to gain everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement. Yesterday I received official confirmation that our humanitarian zone has been approved for the duration of the war." A murmur of surprise and pleasure ran through the small gathering. Harding continued, "This means that Miss Takahara and her companions will remain here, under our protection, until safe repatriation can be arranged after the war ends." The Japanese women bowed deeply to Harding, their faces showing profound relief. No more transfers, no more fear of being sent to inadequate camps in harsh weather. They would stay where they had found kindness and respect. "Furthermore," Harding added, "General Simmons has been reassigned to a desk position in Washington. It seems his railroad connections attracted some unwelcome attention from the Inspector General's office." Ace couldn't help, grinning at this news. Justice sometimes worked in unexpected ways. "And finally," Harding concluded, "I've received permission to expand our humanitarian efforts. The depot will now serve as a reception center for civilian refugees before they're assigned to permanent locations. We'll be receiving proper funding and supplies for this purpose." This announcement brought spontaneous applause from the gathered group. What had begun as one private's act of compassion for a sick woman had grown into something much larger, a haven of humanity in the midst of war. As the group broke up, each heading to their morning duties, Ace touched Emmy's sleeve lightly. "Could I talk to you for a minute?" She nodded, and they walked together toward the shore. The morning sun warmed their faces despite the winter chill. For a while, they simply stood in companionable silence, watching seagulls wheel over the water. Finally, Ace reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden carving. "Made something for you," he said, suddenly shy. "It's not fancy, but—" Emmy took the wooden bird, cradling it in her palms as if it were made of precious metal rather than simple pine. Her fingers traced the carefully carved wings, the smooth curve of the head. "Is beautiful," she whispered. "Like crane." "It's meant to be a dove, actually," Ace explained. "Symbol of peace and freedom. Thought you might like it as a Christmas gift?" "Thank you," Emmy said, looking up at him with eyes that held more than simple gratitude. "I will treasure always." "Your English is getting real good," Ace noticed. "Helen teach me, and books from town." Emmy smiled. "Soon I speak perfect American, yes?" "You're doing just fine," Ace assured her. "Better than my Japanese, that's for sure." They both laughed, the sound carrying across the still water like music. It felt good to laugh together, to share a moment of simple joy after all they had been through. "H-san," Emmy said after a moment, her expression growing serious, "when war end, I must return Japan." "I know," he said quietly. "But I never forget this place. These people. You." She clutched the wooden dove tightly. "In Japan we say that saving a life creates connection that lasts forever. I believe this." "My ma has a saying too," Ace replied. "True friendships don't end with goodbye. Reckon she's right about that, like she is about most things." They stood in silence again, both aware that their paths would eventually diverge, but grateful for the unexpected connection they had found amid the chaos of war. Some bonds, once formed, transcend time and distance. As they walked back toward the depot buildings, Harding met them, his face unusually relaxed. "Ah, there you are. Private Dalton, we're planning a proper Christmas dinner for tomorrow. Think you and Mac can manage something special with what we have?" "Yes, sir," Ace replied confidently. "Between the supplies and what folks from town have donated, we'll have a fine feast." "Excellent." Harding nodded approval. "And Miss Takahara, Dr. Morris tells me you've made a complete recovery. That's very good news." "Yes," Emmy agreed. "Thanks to everyone's care." As Harding walked away, Emmy turned to Ace once more. This is more than enough for a week," she said, echoing her words from that first Thanksgiving meal, when she had been so astonished by the portion on her plate. Ace smiled. Understanding her meaning went far beyond food. "And for as long as you're here," he promised, "we'll make sure abundance never surprises you again." The sun rose higher, bathing the depot in golden light. In the distance, church bells from the town began to ring, announcing Christmas Eve to all who could hear. Their clear tones carried a message of hope and peace that required no translation. As Emmy and Ace walked side by side toward the waiting community, the wooden dove nestled safely in her pocket. Both felt the truth of the moment, that even in the darkest times, human kindness can create light. That enemies can become friends when they recognize their shared humanity. And that sometimes, the simplest acts of compassion can grow into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. On this Christmas Eve morning, as the sun rose over the Pacific, they carried these truths in their hearts like precious gifts. More than enough for a week, more than enough for a lifetime.